Chapter 707. Callan Continent, Central Mountain Range. Dragon Cliff. As the core of the entire Callan Continent, the Dragon Cliff was undoubtedly isolated from the rest of the world. Even if those nosy elves wanted to find the Dragon Cliff, they would first have to cross countless mountains and hills and pass through the territories and lairs of many powerful magical beasts. Therefore, the existence of the Dragon Cliff was only a beautiful legend in the eyes of most elves, and it was impossible for them to see it with their own eyes. With the Dragon Cliff's powerful strength, it naturally did not need the elves to send people to protect it. Therefore, when the Thunder Dragon arms flapped his wide dragon wings and rushed all the way to the Dragon Cliff, it immediately caused a stir and agitation among the dragons. The so-called Dragon Cliff was actually a huge cave opened up on the high cliffs. Green dragons were a kind of forest dragon that lived in groups and liked to place their dragon nests on the high cliffs in the middle of the vast forest. This way, they could not only prevent thieves from coveting the dragon's treasure, but also provide sufficient and high-quality food for the expansion of the dragon group. In the entire Faron Plain, the forest dragons made up of green dragons and emerald dragons could be considered the only dragon group. In addition, in some dark and damp swamps, there might be some multi-headed snake lizards, and they more or less had some dragon blood. It was a pity that the dragons had never recognized these snake lizards, which had low intelligence and behaved like wild beasts. Hence, the giant dragons who were used to seeing green or emerald dragon scales suddenly couldn't hold back their restlessness when they saw a foreign giant dragon covered in azure dragon scales that had the strength of a rank 3 dragon, and they all came out of the dragon cave. For a moment, the surroundings of the towering dragon cliff were filled with ferocious dragons flapping their wings and flying high. The agitation of the dragon cliff quickly alerted the emerald dragons on the upper cliffs. With loud and long dragon roars, 5 majestic emerald dragons swooped down from the clouds, flapping their wide dragon wings, and steadily hovered in front of the Thunder Dragon arms. 2 Grade 4, 1 Grade 3, 2 Grade 2. The Thunder Dragon arms looked around and quickly found out the other party's details. When the emerald dragons suddenly saw a foreign dragon, they were shocked and agitated and could not help but show a hint of vigilance. "Tell me your name, foreign friend." Although the Tier 4 Emerald Dragon in the lead was higher in rank than the Thunder Dragon arms, it was still a rare opportunity to encounter a mutant in this sealed otherworld. It could not help its curiosity. "I, Thunder Dragon arms, am a Tier 3 Dragon Lord from the Lance Plain. Some time ago, I heard that in this remote corner, there's a group of companions who have been left behind by the glory of the great dragon god. So I specially came here to guide you back into the arms of the dragon god." It was unknown whether it was intentional or not, but Arm's voice was especially loud. Under the influence of the sound amplification spell, its reply echoed in the sky above the vast forest for a long time. Hearing Thunder Dragon's words, the 2 Tier 4 Emerald Dragons' expressions changed drastically, shock and solemnity flashing in their amber eyes. Dragon God. Every giant dragon had a different feeling towards this mysterious word. In terms of racial origins, all the dragons of the plain were the subjects of the great dragon god. However, for some dragons that lived leisurely in a sealed otherworld, being able to bask in the glory of the great dragon god wasn't that important. In fact, some strange and unconventional dragon races had even taken the initiative to turn away from the great dragon god due to various reasons, turning to the embrace of some powerful evil dragons or otherworld powerhouses. The forest dragons of the Faron Plain, for example, lived leisurely on the Sapphire Continent, where they had no natural enemies. They chose to ally with the forest elves and enjoy their all-around worship and care. There is no need to mention how happy those days were. Under such circumstances as the forest dragons' upper echelons, the emerald dragons were not that interested in the distant and ethereal dragon god. For a long time, the forest dragons had lived peacefully like this. Now that an emissary of the dragon god had suddenly appeared, the emerald dragons and emerald dragons were somewhat surprised. For a time, all the dragons were stunned. Clearly, They could not decide how to deal with this uninvited and reckless fellow. At this moment, the wind howled in the distance. Two giant dragons flew towards the dragon cliff, one after the other, with long roars. They were the Grade 3 Emerald Dragon Beauty, Aratina, and the Grade 2 Green Dragon Ogu. To be honest, both Lightning Dragon Arms and Emerald Dragon Aratina couldn't help but be taken aback by the sudden appearance of a young dragon of the dragon race. Aratina was surprised that there were other dragons in this world besides the Emerald Dragons and Green Dragons. On the other hand, the Thunder Dragon Arms was purely surprised that there was such a beautiful female dragon in a group of dragons that lived in the wild wilderness. The two of them stared at each other as soon as they saw each other. Apart from surprise and admiration, there was also a rare look of amazement in their eyes. It was obvious that both of them were quite satisfied with each other. If it weren't for the fact that there were too many dragons present, the two of them would have probably huddled together and chatted intimately. Hence, in the next half a day, the few emerald dragons tried their best to invite Arms to the dragon nest in the upper levels of the dragon cliff as a guest so that they could isolate him from the younger generation of their race. However, the experienced Thunder Dragon Arms would not fall for this trick. Instead, he patted his chest and exaggerated his history 10 times in front of the beautiful emerald female dragon Aratina. In order to conquer this little female dragon from another world, Arms even praised the beautiful and magnificent lance plane with his saliva flying everywhere. A plane completely ruled by giant dragons. A plane lord with dragons as each plane lord. Each dragon could rule over a vast territory, and each dragon could control everything in their territory as they pleased. How could such a wonderful thing happen to the giant dragons? From now on, they would no longer have to painstakingly hunt in the illusory forest. From now on, they would no longer have to run around to collect wealth and gems. All of this would be done by the dragonfolk slaves. All they had to do was sleep, and when they woke up, they would have a hearty feast. Then, they would take some time to enjoy the foreign beauties presented to them by the citizens of their territory. Such a comfortable life might have appeared in the sweet dreams of the Faron dragons countless times. But in reality, they were still a normal member of the forest dragons. They still had to constantly sharpen their claws and hunt skills, and then use their hard work to exchange for meager rewards from the forest elves. Dragons were better than dragons, and they'd be angered to death. Listening to the rank 3 Thunder Dragon Arms proudly describe every detail of his daily life, all the young emerald dragons and emerald dragons couldn't help but have their minds wander. Although the older dragons were a little fascinated as well, they'd experienced all sorts of things in the world after all. They were skeptical of the words of this fellow from another world that suddenly popped out of nowhere. If the lance plane was really as good as he described it to be, he should have just stayed there and enjoyed his dragon life. Why didn't he cross the dimensional barrier and come to the Faron plane instead? As for the Thunder Dragon Arms talking about the glory of the great dragon god, these old dragons didn't believe it at all. The dragon god was indeed great. It was precisely because of the existence of the dragon god that the dragons became a powerful species that no one in the multiverse dared to provoke. However, as small rural dragons in a remote plane, it didn't make a difference whether they had the glory of the dragon god or not. Under such circumstances, why would they go looking for trouble to seek the glory of the dragon god? However, such narrow-minded thoughts couldn't be spread, and they couldn't be brought to the surface. That was why even if their strength and ability completely overwhelmed this arrogant rank 3 Thunder Dragon, the 2 rank 4 Emerald Dragons still couldn't openly banish it. While they were still in a daze, that Thunder Dragon not only stirred up a large group of young green dragons, but even a few young and promising Emerald Dragons in the tribe were tempted. In the end, the Tier 3 Thunder Dragon Arms used as trump card the dragon contract filled with dragon race curses. Although the Emerald Dragons before him didn't belong to the same species as the Emerald Dragons that had written the dragon contract, the aura of the Emerald Dragons shared the same origin. With the dragon's contract, the Tier 3 Thunder Dragon openly recruited volunteers and mercenaries who were willing to return a lance with him. Even the Emerald WIRMS were eager to try the recruitment price that the Thunder Dragon offered. At this point, even if it meant falling out with the Thunder Dragon, the Tier 4 Emerald Dragons had no choice but to banish him from the Dragon Cliff. However, to the Emerald Dragon Chief's surprise, the Tier 3 Emerald Dragon had actually caused a huge split in the Dragon Cliff. Led by the Tier 3 Emerald Female Dragon Aratina, 11 dragons actually requested to leave with the Thunder Dragon and explore the Lance Plain, which was filled with opportunities and fortuitous encounters. Among them was the Tier 2 Green Dragon Agu, 11 giant dragons. This represented nearly a third of the forest dragons of the Faron Plain. The Tier 4 Emerald Dragon Chief flew into a rage and prepared to banish the Thunder Dragon by force to suppress the split in the dragon race. However, the agitated dragons weren't so easily appeased. After a brief skirmish, the rank 3 Thunder Dragon, Arms, escaped the Dragon Cliff with heavy injuries. Meanwhile, the young dragons packed up their belongings and followed the Thunder Dragon out of the Dragon Cliff with their treasures. Chapter 708. The battle in the sky above the Dragon Cave continued. For Grade 4 powerhouses, magic power, health, and stamina, factors that limited low-level combatants in the past, were no longer worth mentioning. As a Grade 4 Elven Sword Saint, there were roughly 2 paths of development. One was to sacrifice all of one's magic power, health, stamina, and mental strength in pursuit of the greatest output and the most terrifying destructive power. The other was to convert all of one's strength into extreme speed, the Galestorm Sword Saint. Agassi was undoubtedly walking on the latter path. In every single attack, Agassi's basic attack strength might not be eye-catching, barely exceeding the threshold of 1,000 degrees. However, what was terrifying was his extreme speed and gale steps that allowed him to appear and disappear unpredictably. His sword was like a bolt of lightning streaking across the sky. His enemies could only see his afterimage in the air, and each of his attacks was actually a combination of dozens or even hundreds of attacks. No matter how sturdy the armor or defensive spells were, they would quietly shatter under the crazy stacking of critical damage. His movements were as graceful and agile as a dance. No matter how fierce the enemy's attacks were, he could advance and retreat calmly, annihilating the enemy in the blink of an eye. It was hard to describe the strength of a Grade 4 Galestorm Sword Saint, no matter how perfect a poem was. But facing this clumsy pseudo-Grade 4 spellcaster from another world, he could not completely kill his opponent. Standing high above the Dragon Cave's floating ship, this evil which made of pure black smoke was like a cockroach that could not be killed. Not only was her evil witchcraft very difficult to deal with, even her body, shrouded in black smoke, was not afraid of any form of attack. The shadow body formed from energy did not have any fatal or vital points unique to flesh and blood creatures. Relying on the fact that the strength of her spells was far higher than the Galestorm Sword Saints, who relied on speed and physique to win, the Black Smoke Yuza displayed the power and brutality of a spellcaster to the fullest. Relying on the endless supply of magic energy, the Black Smoke Yuza did not have to worry about running out of witchcraft. Thus, he frequently cast extremely powerful dark spells in hopes of delaying his opponent's movements. The Galestorm Sword Saint Agassi's figure was as fast as the wind, able to freely pass through the paper-thin gaps. However, in the face of the 360-degree darkness that covered the entire map and had no blind spots, he could only furiously flee. Whenever the Storm Sword Saint was forced far away, Black Smoke Uxer would do his best to repair his body or replenish his defensive spells. In any case, he had a lot of mana to squander, so Black Smoke Cloud was overclocking as much as he could without any qualms about selling his father's farm. Under her unrestrained and wanton attacks, the green magic forest around the Dragon Cave could be considered to have suffered an undeserved catastrophe. The dark matter that gushed out like a tidal wave transformed the illusory magic forest, which was originally filled with lush greenery, into a netherworld. It was clearly a bright and sunny afternoon, but within a 3-kilometer radius of the Dragon Cave, all light had mysteriously disappeared. Everything was enveloped in a layer of dusky mist. The sky was gray, the earth was gray, everything in the world was gray. Looking into the distance in this strange and terrible gray mist, the outline of the whole world still existed, but all the objects had changed from their original colors to the present undulating, dark gray blocks of different shades. It was as if a powerful god had suddenly extracted all the colors of this world, leaving it with the most basic, most monotonous gray. Ordinary people might not understand what this scene meant, but Agassi knew. The dark, which had unscrupulously poured out her evil power, had actually used her body as a medium to open up a crack to the shadow plane. The changes in the 3-kilometer radius around her body were actually strange illusions formed by the power of the shadow world projected into the Faerun plane. The shadow world was a special plane that was completely made up of shadow matter and was bordered by almost all material planes. As a large plane that was completely open, the shadow plane never rejected any outsider's visits. It was not like ordinary material planes that had indestructible plane barriers that prevented all beings from visiting and connecting to the plane. It used this method to protect its own plane's consciousness. The shadow world was like a public area that could connect all planes. Anyone who had mastered the power of shadow could use the shadow plane to freely travel between two different planes. Of course, the premise was that the two planes would not reject their entry. The shadow world was so generous to those who controlled the power of shadow, so it became a great weapon in their hands. As long as they could open up a crack to the shadow plane during a battle, they could continuously use the power of the shadow world to infect the surrounding planes. The infected planes would be assimilated into a monotonous space with only shadow energy in a short period of time. This way, the enemy could only fight in the opponent's home field of shadows. After all, Ulthar was only a grade 3 Dark Witch, and she only had a grade 3 Dark Pearl in her hands. Therefore, the limit of her shadow space was 3 kilometers, and she could not further expand her domain of darkness. However, this result was enough. If the Gale, Sword Saint Agassi, wanted to attack Ulthar's shadow body, he would have to travel through the dark shadow space. Ulthar could use her affinity with shadow energy to grasp Agassi's position at a glance. This way, even if Agassi was not her line of sight, she could use her super long-range energy attacks to force Agassi to dodge. Ulthar was like a terrifying poisonous spider hiding behind layers of spider webs, quietly and patiently waiting for the enemy to fall into her trap. At this moment, Ulthar's heart was unprecedentedly free and unrestrained. This was a powerful power that only a grade 4 powerhouse could control, and it was also the feeling of extreme power that only grade 4 powerhouses could experience. Meanwhile, as a tier 3 Dark Witch, she had actually experienced this in an otherworld by relying on a simple energy infusion system. This kind of extreme experience intoxicated her, and she wanted to keep this power for herself forever. She was like a madwoman, completely addicted to the extreme experience of being able to summon the power to destroy heaven and earth with just a wave of her hand or foot. She madly attacked the detestable little bug that was jumping around in her shadow space, delusional enough to use balls of shockingly powerful shadow energy to completely destroy it. Unfortunately, she was not very familiar with the control of this extreme power that was completely beyond her ability, and her method of using the power was so crude that it was hard to look at it directly. If not for the suffocating magical energy, she might not have been able to defend against the Gale, Sword Saint Agassi's ferocious attacks, even with the support of the Wizard's Pagoda system. After several attempts, Agassi realized that he could not completely kill this pseudo-grade 4 witch. So he focused his attacks on the giant floating ship that Ulthar was on. Streaks of sharp blade aura kept falling on the metal shell of the floating warship that was several meters thick, leaving terrifying crisscrossing marks on its surface. After all, Ulthar's defenses could not protect such a huge floating ship, so she could only step up her attacks, forcing Agassi to keep dodging and reducing the frequency of his attacks. The metal shell of the floating ship was several meters thick, and the energy field that was instilled within it might be an impenetrable wall to others. but to a grade 4 Sword Saint, it was no obstacle at all. If not for Ulther's interference with Agassi's strength, a triple shattering slash would have been enough to destroy it. So an hour after the battle started, the battlefield shifted from the vast space outside to the narrow, winding metal tunnel inside the floating ship. Here, the Gale Sword Saint Agassi fully displayed his unpredictable movements and speed, launching a life-and-death battle with Ulther in the narrow space. Every time, Ulther's shadow body would be sliced into thousands of pieces of shadow energy, which would then explode into a terrifying energy storm that could annihilate a normal grade 4 witch. In order to avoid the energy storm, Agassi was forced to retreat from the floating ship. By the time he changed directions and broke into the ship from another angle, Ulther had already rushed over with a new shadow body and engaged him in a fierce battle. This tactic was actually quite effective. The battle extended to the heart of the enemy. Every time an energy storm erupted, the one who suffered the most was not Agassi, who fled in a sorry state, but the floating ship that could not bear the burden. After all, it was not a metal monster controlled by the grade 3 brain monster Gazru, who could transform and repair itself at any time. Instead, it was a secondary metal fortress supported by the modified energy circulation system in Grimm's chip. So, as the energy storm continued to wreak havoc, more and more of the floating ship's energy system was damaged. The direct result of this was a large amount of magic energy that could be supplied to Ulther was lost, and the amount of magic energy that Ulther could control was decreasing. When the floating ship's energy system was damaged by more than 37%, the power that Ulther could control began to plummet uncontrollably. The balance of power that the floating ship had maintained all this time was slowly slipping toward the point of imbalance. Ulther, Grimm, and every other sorcerer could do nothing about this. After all, it was already a miracle that a group of grade 2 and grade 3 nobodies could hold off a grade 4 Elven Sword Saint for so long. Moreover, after fighting for 1.5 hours, the Elven Sword Saint was not unscathed. The omnipresent shadow energy was constantly attacking his body. Chapter 709. By the time Ulther's strength dropped to tier 3, the battle had only lasted for an hour and 40 minutes. At this time, there were only 20 minutes left before the 2 hours that Alice requested. 20 minutes sounded like a short time, but it was extremely difficult and bloody to drag it out. Although Ulther, who had dropped to tier 3, was still as evil and ferocious as ever, she could only die with a single slash from the tier for Elven Sword Saint. Ulther charged forward 3 times in a row, but she was killed the moment she got close to the Elven Sword Saint. At this point in the battle, Grimm knew that Ulther had lost the ability to pin down the Elven Sword Saint. It was pointless to waste any more magical energy on her. Therefore, after summoning Ulther back, Grimm controlled most of the magical energy and directed it to the magic cannons that were everywhere in the cabin. In the thick, twisted metal tunnel, the Elven Sword Saint Agassi strode forward with his sword in both hands. Every time he swung his sword, an invisible, sharp force would shoot out. The magic cannons that were hidden in the corners of the cabin and at the end of the tunnel could only fire once before they were destroyed. The defensive firepower could not stop the Elven Sword Saint at all. Only the metal magical machinery that was charging at them from the end of the tunnel could barely slow down the Elven Sword Saint's footsteps. However, these metal machines that were 3 to 4 meters tall and weighed 7 to 8 tons could not even last half a second in front of the Elven Sword Sage before they were sliced into countless scattered parts and fragments of the magical machines that shone with black magical energy by the swift flashes of the blade. Left with no choice, Grimm could only pour an excessive amount of magical energy into the metal magical machines in the later stages, hoping that they could cause some trouble for the Elven Sword Saint when they were destroyed. Unfortunately, after half a year of high-intensity battles, there were too few combat magical machines left in the floating warship. Even if he controlled them to charge forward one by one, it would not slow down the Elven Sword Saint. Therefore, in the later stages, Grimm simply repaired the construction machines and sent them to the battlefield. Grim had fantasized about blocking the tunnel to stop the elven sword saint from advancing. However, the metal walls that were half a meter thick were as fragile as a piece of cheese in front of the snowflake-like gleam of the elven sword saint's sword. That elven sword sage simply gave up on the ready-made metal passageway and switched to using his saber to cut through the metal walls, directly advancing in a straight line towards the core area of the battleship. At this time, Grim had sent all the cannon fodder he could, but they could only hold on for 7 more minutes. There were only 13 minutes left. What could he rely on to hold on? The cannon fodder was already dead. Could it be? Could it be that they were sending the Magi to their deaths? I'll go. The Dragon Man Zacha, who didn't speak much, was the first to step forward. It must be said that once a strange creature like the Draconians recognized a master, their loyalty was truly touching. In the past, as the Tier 3 Thunder Dragon Arms' servant, it had never regretted being eaten by its master, even when it had nearly become a dry dragon. Ever since Arms transferred his soul contract to Grim, he had pledged his loyalty to the wizard from the wizarding world. However, none of this was an obstacle. Aside from Mary and Alice, the only person he could trust was this stubborn Tier 2 Dragonoid. Hence, when Grim saw this scene, he hesitated for a moment, but he still couldn't bear to send the Dragonoid to its death. Sensing Grim's scorching gaze, the Magi present could not help but lower their heads in dejection. That was a Tier 4 sword sage. Even Optimus Prime's metal magical equipment could be cut down as easily as chopping melons and vegetables. The Dragonians' dragon scales and armor, which they prided themselves on being tough, could never withstand a casual slash from the Elven Sword Sage. That was why anyone below the 3rd level would be instantly killed by a single slash. Even if Ulthar, who had fought against the Elven Sword Sage for 300 rounds, dared to face the Elven Sword Sage head-on, it would only be a matter of one more slash. However, they had no choice but to send someone to block the Elven Sword Sage's path. If the Elven Sword Sage continued to charge forward, it would be difficult for them to escape death. Just when the atmosphere in the hall suddenly became anxious, an old and hoarse voice abruptly sounded. "You don't have to go. I'll go alone." Everyone raised their heads in surprise, only to discover that the person who spoke was the old and hunchbacked poison centipede, Ender. Grim frowned, intending to reject the offer. After all, Poison Centipede was Alice's only relative left in the world. If anything happened to her, Alice would probably blame him for the rest of her life. However, Grim did not have the luxury of time to think or hesitate. Ulthar had already spoken up. "I support her." Ulthar glanced at Ender with a stern expression, then said to Grim solemnly, "She's already prepared to die. Let her go." As a Tier 3 Magus, Ulthar had sharp eyes. With a glance, she could tell that Poison Centipede had consumed an excessive amount of poison before coming here. Even if she was not sent to her death, she would not be able to live for more than a quarter of an hour. Grim looked at Ender's face that was gradually turning black, and his heart was also unusually heavy. Finally, he nodded silently in agreement. "Give this to Bliss. He might need it in the future." Ender, the Poison Centipede, threw a knowledge crystal to Grim and laughed hysterically. He held his magic staff, which was 2 heads taller than him, and knocked on the metal floor. Then, he rushed into one of the metal tunnels. While moving quickly in the metal tunnel, Poison Centipede threw away the staff that was in his way and began to crazily swallow the colorful bottles and jars in his waist pouch. He opened a small cork gourd with his left hand and took out a black centipede-like insect from it. He stuffed it into his mouth and chewed with all his might. Black and stinky insect blood seeped out from between his teeth, mixed with the blood that flowed out from his mouth after being cut by the insect's shell. It made Ender's appearance even more terrifying. And this was just the beginning. While staggering forward, Ender was desperately stuffing all kinds of scary bugs and colorful, mysterious magic medicines into his mouth. Although they all had different effects, the changes they brought to Ender were completely the same. Ender was expanding a skinny and haggard old witch who was less than 6 meters tall and weighed less than 70 kilograms, now had a purple face. Her body quickly swelled up like a balloon. Ender's small body swelled up 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, as if he had been injected with an excessive amount of gas. His wrinkled skin had now become extremely thin and transparent. One could vaguely see the viscous liquid inside his body that was about to boil. A thick yellow-green smoke lingered behind poison centipede Ender's bloated and ugly body. It floated and stuck to the metal tunnel, producing a terrifying sizzling sound that made one's teeth ache and legs go weak. Wherever poison centipede Ender's fat body passed, the metal tunnel behind him would be corroded by the poison and become full of holes. The half-melted metal walls turned into black molten iron and began to drip and collapse like melting wax. In an instant, the entire metal tunnel began to melt. Agassi walked between the metal tunnels with a pale face. The elven sword in his hand danced like it was flying, blocking the energy rays that shot from all over the tunnel. At this moment, he was too lazy to get rid of these trash that was not very lethal. Instead, he focused on searching for traces of the enemy. There was a sturdy passageway made entirely of metal, a huge and spacious central hall, a small laboratory filled with mysterious facilities, and many small metal cabins whose purpose was unknown. Walking in this metal world, Agassi's anger and anxiety were accumulating bit by bit under the ever-present laser attacks. What were the enemies trying to do? He could not see through them, nor could he guess. This was just a joint order from the Elven Court and the Elven Temple. They wanted him to lead a team to completely destroy this group of abominable witches that continued to invade Callan Continent. To be honest, Agassi was disdainful when he suddenly heard this news. The enemy didn't even have a grade 4 in their team. How dare they cause trouble in Callan Continent, which was under the protection of the gods. Therefore, when he led the team here, he was full of confidence. He even boasted in front of the Elven Court. However, in the previous battle, he had actually been held back for an hour by pseudo-tier 4 ranker who had used a strange technique. Moreover, the team he led had also suffered quite a number of casualties. This was undoubtedly a cruel blow to his reputation and prestige. Filled with anger and frustration, Agassi shuttled through one winding metal tunnel after another. At first, he was still trying to find a way to go down, but later, he could not hold back his anger. So he simply broke through the metal walls and went straight to the bottom of the ship. Another snow-white sword light flashed. The metal wall in front of him instantly broke open a crack that was big enough for him to pass through, allowing him to easily cross over with his feet. Using his bright and sharp eyes, Agassi glanced at the 30-meter-long metal tunnel in front of him. He did not try to move to either side. Instead, he came to the metal wall on the other side, planning to break through the wall again. But the moment he raised his sword, Agassi was slightly stunned. He turned his head and looked at the endless darkness at the end of the metal tunnel. Over there, a strange creature filled with a pungent stench was howling dryly as it moved towards him step by step. Even with Agassi's magic resistance, he couldn't help but feel a little dizzy as the stench of blood spread through the tunnel. However, this slight discomfort quickly disappeared under the circulation of his powerful Do Chi. It was just a poisonous creature sent to block the way. The enemy only had this kind of trick. Agassi glanced at it and did not care. With such a slow speed, how could it possibly catch up to his swift figure? Agassi did not want to fight it at all. He swung his sword, planning to break through the wall and escape. But the moment he looked away, the fat figure suddenly pounced forward and shouted, "Die with me." Chapter 710. The thick black liquid covered the entire corridor, including where Agassi stood. A thin layer of Do Chi was spread around his body, completely blocking the poisonous liquid that was coming at him. Agassi was enraged when he saw the poisonous liquid slowly flowing down from the outside of the combat energy barrier. Since when did a Tier 4 powerhouse become so worthless? Even a Tier 1, which dared to spit on his face. Although this kind of low-grade, poisonous liquid couldn't do much damage to him, Agassi's action showed that she was looking down on a Tier 4 powerhouse. The poison centipede Ender had swallowed countless types of terrifying poisons in one go. Then, he used all of his blood essence and mental strength to self-destruct, increasing the power of the mixed poisonous liquid. 216 degrees of acid damage and 247 degrees of corrosive damage. A Tier 1, which being able to explode with such frightening power was beyond anyone's expectations. Unfortunately, this kind of damage might be a great threat to a Tier 2 powerhouse, but to a Tier 4 Sword Saint, it was no different from a smelly bug exploding in front of a lion. It wouldn't threaten his life at all. The only thing it would do was probably make the lion frown. After his anger subsided, Agassi activated the combat energy barrier and planned to continue forward. However, to his dismay, the barrier didn't budge at all. That sticky poisonous liquid was not only highly toxic, but also surprisingly sticky, firmly trapping Sword Saint Agassi in place. Agassi could no longer hold back the rage burning in his heart. Violent combat energy burst out of his body, and countless dazzling rays of golden light swept in all directions. In an instant, the tough and thick metal deck, the sticky and terrifying venom, the highly toxic yellow-green poisonous smoke, and the half-melted metal passageway, corroded by the venom. Everything was reduced to nothingness by the dazzling golden saber light. At this moment, even the toughest metal could not withstand the high-frequency cutting of the Tier 4 Sword Saint Agassi's violent combat energy. The Tier 4 Sword Saint Agassi stood proudly in the air with his two swords in hand. Nothing larger than a grain of rice could be seen within 50 meters of him. On the other hand, the Sword Saint's violent strike had dug out a void sphere with a diameter of 100 meters from the middle of the airship. 100 meters away, the corridor was as smooth as a mirror. A corner of the cabin that had been cut off was now clearly visible to Agassi. The obstacles ahead had already been cleared, and the enemy leader's panicked figure flashed past at the end of the corridor. Agassi wasn't in a hurry to give chase. Instead, he stood in the void and slowly adjusted his breathing. Even with Agassi's strength, he couldn't easily release such a violent attack. Agassi waited until he had stabilized the surging combat energy in his body before raising his sword with a sinister smile. He planned to kill all these detestable magi in one go. Unfortunately, the enemy was still one step ahead of him. Almost as soon as he finished adjusting his breathing, the giant floating ship beneath him suddenly trembled. A surge of terrifying, violent magical energy gushed out from the cracks in the walls and the metal passageways, sweeping toward Agassi with an earth-shattering force and sweeping toward the periphery. The spatial furnace had exploded. In fact, since the beginning of the battle, the self-destruction of the spatial furnace had been Grimm's trump card. However, considering that the entire battlefield would collapse after the self-destruction of the spatial furnace, Grimm could only use it as his last resort, either to escape from the tiger's mouth or to cut off the lizard's tail. Grimm had originally planned to use the temporary wizard's pagoda and Ulthar to hold out for a period of time and retreat once Alice got the Staff of Prophecy. The explosion of the giant floating ship would definitely force the pursuing elves away, giving them enough time to retreat. Unfortunately, Grimm did not expect that Alice would choose to forcefully level up as soon as she received the Prophecy Scepter. Choosing to advance on the front lines at such a dangerous time? To be honest, Grimm couldn't figure it out. However, since Alice had chosen this path as her biggest investor, Grimm had no choice but to carry the battlefield. Under the repeated attacks of the elf sword saints, the floating ship and Ulthar were forced to retreat step by step. Finally, the entire line was defeated. The 107 magic cannons that covered the entire ship were completely destroyed by the enemy. The remaining 16 metal magic machines were all used up, dying gloriously in battle. The 21 construction machines that were hurriedly repaired to block the way were also used up. The poisoned centipede Ender, who had lost his will to die, went to intercept them alone, even with such a huge sacrifice. They only managed to delay the elves' sword saint for 10 minutes. But they were still 10 minutes away from the 2 hours that Alice had requested. 10 minutes. It might sound like a short while, but on the battlefield today, it was more than enough for the elves' sword saint to cut them into pieces 100 times over. Hence, the moment he sensed that the elves' sword saint had escaped, Grimm gave the order to detonate the spatial furnace. Grimm had been prepared for this. Before the explosion of the spatial furnace, he had already tried to collapse the passageway outside the dragon cave. All the magi and gnomes then hid in the narrow passageway outside the dragon cave's treasure hall. With the cover of the mountain, the magic waves formed by the explosion of the spatial furnace poured out towards the top of the dragon cave and the exit of the valley. For a moment, the entire mountain range rumbled and trembled. The originally peaceful and beautiful valley was swept away by the violent magic waves, as if it had been trampled by a herd of wild bulls. Countless towering ancient trees were broken and collapsed, and large patches of thorns, shrubs, and grasses were swept into the air, revealing the dark soil and the greenish-gray mountain rocks below. Even the giant floating ship that had stubbornly persisted despite the two rank four Magi's attacks was thrown out by the boundless shockwave. It broke apart in mid-air, shattering into countless metal fragments and chunks of different sizes. The mountains and forests in its path were devastated beyond compare. The numerous Magi hiding in the dragon cave worked together to cast defensive spells, deflecting the falling debris in large chunks of rock. Above their heads, below their feet, and all the surrounding rock walls trembled and trembled. Quite a few goblin engineers were unable to dodge in time and were crushed to death by the falling rocks, adding to the stench of blood in the air. Fortunately, the green dragon Agu had put in a lot of thought when choosing the dragon cave. Even with such a gentle stomp, apart from a small part of the dragon cave collapsing and large cracks, there were no signs of the whole place collapsing. This also prevented some unnecessary casualties. When the power of the berserk magic was exhausted, the grass and wood fragments, mud, and other debris scattered down from the sky. The once peaceful valley once again appeared in front of everyone, but it had already changed beyond recognition. It was a scene of desolation. The mountain where the dragon cave was located was broken in the middle, the upper half of the collapsed mountain tilting and sticking to the left side of the mountain in a strange position. A large amount of rock fragments, mud, and sand had completely covered the entrance to the dragon cave. If they wanted to open a path in, it would probably take a long time and a lot of manpower. There was not a single trace of greenery in the valley. All the ancient trees, grass, and even half a meter of soil had been swept away, scattering bits and pieces in the surrounding forest for tens of kilometers. The quiet valley and the forest within a radius of 6 to 7 miles had been shaved into a bald spot by the shockwave of the explosion. Looking down from the sky, the boundless green forest looked like a huge acne that had suddenly been added to it. It was extremely dazzling. In the sky above the desolate and sorrowful valley, there was only a lonely figure standing alone. Although Agassi had escaped the explosion, he had not come out unscathed. His muscular left upper arm was lacerated, and dark red blood flowed down his arm like a snake, soaking the blade in his hand before dripping down to the sky. Although his injuries were not serious, a dignified Grade 4 Sword Saint had actually been injured by a group of Grade 2 and 3 Magi. This painful reality truly pierced his heart. Roar. With an earth-shattering roar, Agassi finally let go of everything. He swung his arms wildly, slashing out at the speed of 13 slashes per second. Standing in the air, Agassi's body did not move. With a flick of his wrist, the blade slashed out wildly at the mountain where the dragon cave was located. Every time the incomparably fierce and violent energy bombarded the mountain, it would leave a terrifying 2-meter deep, 7-meter wide blade mark. Just like that, Agassi slashed out furiously. Gravel flew out from the walls of the mountain. Rocks crumbled, and clouds of dust rose, covering everything in a thick layer of dust. However, no matter how thick the dust was, it could not hide the dazzling light left behind by the dazzling blade slashes. The huge mountain was actually trembling under the continuous attacks of the sword saints of the elven sword saints. Under Agassi's crazy slashing and attacking, a strange tunnel began to appear, extending into the interior of the mountain. Of course, Grimm and the rest who were hiding in the mountain had no idea what was happening outside. However, the mountain that had just quieted down suddenly began to shake for no reason. Strange rumbling sounds came from outside. This was definitely not good news. Of everyone present, Ulther's senses were the strongest. She closed her eyes and carefully examined the movements outside. After a moment, her expression froze, and she roared in fear. Damn it, that sword saint is going crazy. He actually wants to dig his way in through the mountain. Hearing Ulther's words, the expressions of the male and female magi changed drastically. They had all witnessed the power of the sword saint of the elven sword saints. If he charged in, they were afraid that. Ulther could not help but angrily say, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and call Alice out, then we can escape together. If we wait any longer, none of us will survive." Sophia and Chef, who had been guarding the entrance of the hall, stepped forward and said resolutely. Before the leader sealed the door, he said very clearly that no one is allowed to go in and disturb her. Look at the situation, and you're still thinking about leveling up. Ulther's voice turned cold. If you don't want to call her, I'll go in and call her. Sophia and Chef looked terrified, and both looked at Grimm. If there was anyone present who could stop Ulther, it was probably Grimm alone. Was he in a hurry to escape and get Alice to give up on leveling up, or was he willing to take the risk and wait? Chapter 711. Lord Ulther, I won't blame you if you dark witches want to retreat in advance. Under everyone's gazes, Grimm, who was dressed in a bright red magus robe, frowned slightly. He spoke calmly, as if he did not care about the loud rumble that was getting louder. Grimm, why are you guarding a tree so stubbornly? Although Alice is the leader of the Fate Witches, she only has the strength of a pitiful grade 1. She doesn't have much say in the Northern Witch Council. So, if you're willing to join us, I promise you that our leader will give you more resources, a bigger territory, and better development. You see, although Ulther was a little anxious, he was still willing to fight for his family against an outstanding wizard like Grimm. In recent years, the development of the Northern Witch group in the Central Continent had not been smooth. If they could get such a talented and ambitious wizard to join them, it would undoubtedly be a great help to their family. Hearing this, the expressions of Sophia and Shave, who were the deputy leaders of the Fate Witches, turned extremely ugly. However, they did not have the strength nor the qualifications to argue with a grade 3 Dark Witch. They could only look at Grimm with ashen expressions, wondering if he would be moved by her. 3 more minutes. A gentle smile appeared on Grimm's youthful face. We'll know the result in 3 minutes. Don't you want to wait a little longer? Ulther opened his mouth, wanting to persuade him again, but he was interrupted by a huge rock falling from above. The rumbling sound was getting closer and closer. The violent sword energy shot out by the fairy sword master struck the nearby passageway, causing a huge mountain roar to reverberate in the narrow space. It was so loud that it hurt one's eardrums. I can't wait any longer. A ruthless expression flashed across Ulther's face. I won't stay here to die with you. We dark witches are going to leave first. At her command, the remaining 3 dark witches gathered around Ulther. A dark shadow, as thick as ink, appeared and enveloped them. The entire area was filled with strange, distorted shadows. After a few moments, the shadows dissipated and the dark witches could no longer be seen. The only remaining Destiny, which was someone who had just been promoted not many years ago. She obviously couldn't adapt to the situation in front of her. Looking at the dark witches who quietly escaped into the shadow plane, she could not help but show an envious expression on her face. The young Destiny Witch's face was filled with anxiety when she thought about how she had to stay here and wait for their leader, who no one knew whether she was dead or alive. What about you guys? Seeing everyone's expression, Grimm calmly said, I won't force you to stay. If you want to leave, you can leave now. Under Grimm's burning gaze, the wind wizard Dysilla, Medusa, Goblin Tigule, and Dragonman Zachary all bowed and said in unison, "We pledge our lives to follow you, sir." On the other side, the Blood Knight, Blood Elf, and Winlier stood silently behind Mary. Their expressions were calm, as if they were following Mary's lead. "Why are you looking at me?" Mary rolled her eyes at Grimm. "Of course I'm with you." Grimm's tensed face finally relaxed a little as he said in a deep voice, 2 minutes. Time was ticking away. The time that no one usually paid attention to seemed so long and torturous at this moment. Everyone held their breaths and focused, silently listening to the loud rumbling coming from not far away. The Sword Saint of the Elves had obviously opened up a passage through half of the mountain and was heading straight for them. Judging from the sound, it was only 20 to 30 meters away from where they were. Following the Sword Saint's violent aura, the mountain trembled even more violently. The dust that fell from above almost buried everyone on the spot. In order to avoid being detected by the Sword Saint of the Elves, everyone did not put up a magic shield. They only relied on their bodies to resist the rocks that kept rolling down from the ceiling. The air in the passage became more and more polluted. The suffocating dust filled the air, making it almost impossible to breathe. Fortunately, none of them were weaklings. Not breathing for an hour wouldn't kill them. However, waiting anxiously and blankly made them feel even more tormented. They did not know whether they would escape successfully or die tragically. The more it was like this, the more panicked and helpless they became. 1 minute. This time, Grimm used a mental message to send his voice into everyone's ears. Suddenly, a stone slab on one side of the rock wall exploded with a loud bang. Then, a dazzling saber light shot out from inside. The blade light sliced through the crowd silently, directly piercing through the body of a Blood Knight and the left arm of the Ice Maiden, Chef. In the next second, blood splattered everywhere. The Blood Knight immediately exploded into a cloud of blood, while the Ice Maiden's left arm slid off silently at the shoulder. A warm fountain of blood spurted out from the wound. Chef only let out a pained cry before holding it in. However, the thick smell of blood still spread out and was sensed by the Sword Saints of the Elves who were frantically searching for them. "Attack!" Just as everyone's scalps went numb and did not know what to do, Grimm roared. He first condensed a huge lava fireball and threw it towards the wall where the blade light had come from. Hence, in the next second, concentrated spells rained down on the nearby rock wall. The violent attacks caused a new collapse, and the Magi all hugged their heads and scurried away in the narrow area, trying to avoid the huge rocks that fell from the sky. Although the entire process was extremely dangerous, they finally managed to block the Sword Saint outside. However, how many attacks from the Sword Saint of the Elves could this thin wall of rock withstand? Just as everyone was feeling uneasy, the door that had been sealed for a long time suddenly opened. A beautiful and elegant figure stood within, silently examining everyone. "Thank you, everyone." Alice's familiar, cold voice rang out. "I've already leveled up. Now we can escape." Grimm took a step forward and exchanged glances with Alice. Seeing her resolute nod, his tensed face immediately blossomed into a gratified smile. In the next moment, Grimm waved his hand, and 6 brown demon puppets' crystal cores landed on the ground. They quickly condensed into 6 huge rock pythons. Quick, quick, quick! Get into the stomachs of the rock pythons. We have to leave through the underground." Ever since he had advanced to become a magus, Grimm had not used these low-grade rock pythons that only had the strength of high-ranked acolytes. However, at this moment, they were quite suitable to be used as mounts. The Magi had jumped from the despair of being attacked by a powerful enemy to the joy of escaping from a hopeless situation. They did not even have time to adjust their emotions before they were swallowed by the rock pythons with their mouths wide open. The Magi were treated better, with each of them having a rock python. Mary's vampire followers, on the other hand, could only regretfully share a rock python. After swallowing everyone, under Grimm's command, the rock pythons burrowed into the soil beneath their feet. They followed the path between the mountain and the wall and dug frantically into the depths of the earth. The last rock python swayed its thick body and slithered into the hull of the dragon nest, swallowing the piles of magic gems and glowing magic weapons in big mouthfuls. When an earth-shattering explosion sounded from outside the cave, the rock python reluctantly gave up on the rest of the dragon's treasure. It crashed into the wall and frantically chased after the group. After 3 flicks of his fingers, Agassiz, the elven sword saint, walked into the cave with large strides, his body covered in a dazzling golden light. Looking at the 5 or 6 1-meter-wide holes in the ground and the empty hull of the dragon nest, he angrily roared towards the sky. As for the dragon's treasure in the center of the hall, he did not even have the interest to look at it. For the first time, as a grade 4, elven sword saint, Agassiz was secretly shocked by the cruel and ruthless methods of these magi from another world. The rock serpent slithered through the ground silently. Through the cracks on the rock python's body, Grim could clearly see that the solid soil was smoothly pushed to the sides of the python's body. The rock python was like a fish swimming freely in the middle of the rock stratum. Huge rocks appeared from time to time, but were quickly left far behind. After all, the rock pythons were only high-level apprentice magic puppets, so they could not go too deep underground. Otherwise, even the rocks formed by the earth element would be crushed by the huge pressure. After following the rock stratum for a while, the group of rock pythons turned around and began to dig diagonally into the ground. Grim and Alice shared the same rock python. Alice straightened her body and stood in front of Grim, silently watching the rocks, worms, roots, and other strange things that flashed past in front of the rock python. Ender is dead. After hesitating for a while, Grim finally spoke hesitantly. I know. Alice's reply was cold and calm. You know about it? Grim was surprised and asked subconsciously. I knew before I advanced. Alice did not turn around, her tone still as calm as ever. However, Grim, who was familiar with Alice, frowned slightly. It was obvious from her calmness that he could sense the violent turbulence under the ice. Grim reached out and held Alice's shoulder, feeling her body tremble slightly. If you want to cry, then cry to your heart's content, Grim said sadly. Alice still did not turn around, but Grim could faintly feel the great pain in her heart. The path of pursuing power was a lonely one. There were many times when one had to pay a huge price to obtain power, and this price wasn't something that anyone could afford. Grim, can I ask you for a favor? Alice finally asked after a long time. Tell me, if you have power one day, I hope that you can destroy this plane for me. Chapter 712. Fair and Plain, Shadow Island. The Shadow Island, which had been quiet for a while, was once again bustling with noise and excitement. Fully loaded ships docked at the port in the western part of the island. A large number of alien coolies, under the supervision of supervisors, were busy carrying boxes of heavy goods out of the cabins and into tall, solid stone warehouses near the coastline. Ever since the outbreak of the witch disaster, this flourishing scene had never stopped. A steady stream of loot from the Farron continent and the Callan continent had almost filled all the warehouses on the periphery of the Shadow Island. Even some warehouses near the core area of the island had to be vacated to store or imprison the looted wealth and slaves. Because of the smooth progress of the war, the witches who went to the Farron continent even joined forces to break into a small duchy near the sea. Then they roped in some wandering nobles and bandits nearby and formed a nondescript witch union. Now, no matter what, the war led by the Pale, which had completely established a foothold in the Farron continent. Even if the witch disaster ended, it would be countless times more difficult for the mainland's inherent forces to drive them out. Because of the huge harvest of the witches, it naturally attracted all the large chambers of commerce and slave traders throughout the Farron continent. Of course, those famous chambers of commerce still had to care about their own reputation, so they only sent some dark agents that they secretly controlled. Overall, the Pale Witch and the others had the most harvest from this witch disaster. Although there was not much of a breakthrough in the Callan continent, the witches had turned the world upside down. Not to mention anything else. Just the millions of undead that came out of the Scar of Death in the middle of the Callan continent had brought about 200,000 civilian losses to the forest elves. Although the Elven Kingdom had dispatched elite troops and a large number of strong people, they had already killed most of the undead. However, the magic forest, which had been trampled by the undead, was greatly damaged. It would probably take at least nearly 100 years to recover. Moreover, the Dark Witch and the Destiny Witch, who had completed the task, had also brought disaster to the Pegasus Spring and the Dragon Cliff. According to the report of the Dark Witch in the Huin Islands, the Elven Kingdom had lost the strange magical beast Pegasus forever. In addition, the forest dragons that had been living peacefully in the Dragon Cliff had also split up. About 1/3 of the green dragons and emerald dragons had been abducted by a thunder dragon that had crossed the border. To think that such a thing could happen. To be honest, it was beyond everyone's and the dragon's expectations. 6 months had passed since the beginning of the war, and the witch disaster was coming to an end. Therefore, those witches who had completed their tasks or were in urgent need of rest returned to Shadow Island and began to gather here. According to the agreement, the Pale Witches would only open the planar gate to send everyone back to the Sorcerer World 8 months after the Witch Calamity began. Therefore, even if the Dark Witches and the Destiny Witches completed the task ahead of time, they still had to stay on Shadow Island for 2 more months. The Dark Witches, who had returned to Shadow Island before the Destiny Witches, met up with their companions who had just been resurrected from the energy pool on the island. The witches of other factions who had returned from the Faron continent to rest were overjoyed, and they all offered a high price to hire them as thugs, so that they could fight again before the end of the Witch Calamity. Therefore, the Dark Witches did not stay on the island for a few days. They all joined the teams of different factions and set foot on the ship to the Faron continent. Grimm and his party finally arrived at Shadow Island without a hitch. The last time they left, they had swaggered away on a giant floating ship. But this time, they were much more low-key. They boarded a ship that transported slaves and returned to Shadow Island. They stepped on the swaying gangplank and got off the smelly and dirty ship. As soon as they set foot on the stone pier, a group of overseers and slaves surrounded them. But when they saw the eye-catching sorcerer robes of this group, the slaves scattered to the sides, not daring to block the path of the sorcerers. A witch in charge of the pier hurried over, and when she saw Grimm and Alice leading the way, she quickly bowed. "Welcome back to Shadow Island, Lady Alice. Please come with me." As the territory of the Ashen Witches, Shadow Island had been strictly divided into a fixed hierarchy. The 20 to 30 kilometer area in the center of the island belonged to the sorcerers. Only sorcerers and those they approved could enter and leave freely. Ordinary outsiders could not get close to that area. The periphery of the central area was clearly divided into 4 areas: east, west, south, and north. The west was the port area, mainly responsible for the loading and unloading of goods and the transfer of warehouses. The north was the trade area, where all the trading companies had set up stalls or auction houses. The east was the magic area, responsible for selling equipment or items related to extraordinary powers. The south was the slave area, where large-scale slave auctions took place almost every day. So, under the guidance of the little witch, Grimm and his party passed through the noisy pier, walked past the crowded warehouses, and followed a grayish-white stone path into the island for nearly 10 kilometers before they reached the entrance of the sorcerer area. The periphery of the sorcerer area was filled with all kinds of bloodthirsty demonic plants and terrifying monsters. There were only a few special entrances and exits, which were guarded by the witches and the wizard beast army. This way, even if the enemy sneaked into Shadow Island, it would be extremely difficult for them to sneak into the sorcerer area. At the entrance, the witch in charge of guarding shone a strange crystal at Grimm and his party. After confirming everyone's identity, she let them into the sorcerer area. Now that they were here, they could move about freely and were no longer restricted by anything. Grimm and his party had paid a great price for this trip to the Callan continent, but the rewards were equally great. In terms of personnel, the Destiny Witches had sent a total of 8 people, including Alice, but only 4 of them could return to Shadow Island alive. Fortunately, Alice had successfully advanced to Grade 2, which completely eliminated the imminent threat to her life. With the basic lifespan of a Grade 2 wizard of 300 to 500 years, Alice had a lot of time to slowly understand and experience the invisible benefits of the Scepter of Prophecy. As for Grimm's party, they had suffered great losses. First, they had lost people. The poisoned centipede, Endur, and the 3-headed hound, Nguja, had both died on the Callan continent. Mary had lost a Blood Knight, but they had gained 7 more Blood Elves. Their strength had increased instead of decreasing. The insect Lich, Bliss, was still trapped near Greenwater City. Although he was safe for now, it would be difficult for him to return in a short time. Secondly, there was the loss of resources. That was a huge loss. The greatest loss was, of course, the floating warship, as well as the hundreds of metal magic machines and 100 goblin technicians and engineers. Of course, these losses could be made up for with the help of the goblin plane. However, the self-destructing spatial furnace was one less. Before finding suitable magic alloys, Grimm would not be able to build more similar warships. Of the newly formed magical machine warriors, only the Ripper controlled by the Goblin Tygol was left. The other pseudo-Grade 2 goblin army had been destroyed in the battle in the Dragon Cave, causing everyone to feel extremely resentful. The total value of these items was more than 1,000,000 magic crystals. Even if they sold the forest elves they had captured for a sky-high price, it would not be enough to make up for this loss. But fortunately, through this battle in another plane, the Crimson family and the Witches of Destiny had a deeper interaction. If one looked at it from the side, the Destiny Witches had finally found their place and showed signs of merging with the Crimson family. This was undoubtedly Grimm's greatest gain from this trip. A Grade 2 Destiny, who had lost the shackles of her life force and could be completely trusted. Perhaps only Grimm could clearly understand how much he had gained from this trip. In the history of the Northern Witches, the Destiny Witches were like the eyes they used to explore and observe the outside world. They had the historical mission of seeing through opportunities, guiding the way, and observing the minutest details. All the Destiny Witches did not have powerful combat abilities and could only rely on the protection of other witch sisters to survive. Hence, their status in the witch faction was actually very high. Now, Grimm had actually pulled Alice into his faction. In the foreseeable future, the Crimson family would not have any worries and would welcome a huge opportunity for development. After settling down in the Wizard Tower on the Shadow Island, all the Crimson family witches had nothing to do. As a reward for this battle, each wizard was given 10 to 30 elven slaves, as well as magic gems weighing in kilograms. Of course, the most important thing was the other world's knowledge from the Callan continent. Among the forest elves, there were elven mages and druids, 2 major spellcasters. Although the core of their system revolved around divine spells, it still had a lot of reference and research value for wizards who were also spellcasters. As spoils of war for following the family to the brink of death, all the Crimson sorcerers and Destiny Witches who participated in the battle also received a copy of the Knowledge Crystal. It was much more valuable than the elven slaves and magic gems. Anyway, there were still 2 months before the plane door would open again. Hence, some witches from the family who could not stay idle also invited the Destiny Witches to join the team heading to the Fane continent. There, the teams of witches from various factions were happily fighting with the natives of the Fane continent. If they went there, they would be just in time for the harvest, and they might even be able to get some other benefits. Hence, under Mary's lead, the Wind Wizard Sella, Medusa, the Goblin Tigul, and the others all ran to the Fane continent. Only the Dragon Man Zachary maintained his uninterested attitude, loyally guarding Grimm. Grimm took the opportunity to stay on the Shadow Island, organizing the things that needed to be organized and auctioning the things that needed to be auctioned. He also took the opportunity to collect some special resources from the Fane Plane. Chapter 713. Alice, Elementary Grade 2. Occupation, Leader of the Witches of Destiny. Stats, Strength, 4 Vitality, 3 Agility, 5 Spirit, 22. Occupation skills, Perception of Destiny, Divination, Destiny, Interference. Retracting the strange blue light, Grimm closed his eyes tiredly and rubbed his temples. Grimm had used the AI chip's detection and scanning abilities to get a complete picture of Alice's basic stats. Of course, this was only possible after Alice suppressed her body's instincts to defend herself and counterattack. Otherwise, with Alice's identity as the leader of the Witches of Destiny, there were not many people in this world who could detect her from a distance. So, do you have any conclusions? Alice yawned and stretched herself lazily. She ignored Grimm's gaze that was filled with blue light. Everyone had their own secrets and privacy. There was no need to be so clear about everything, or else life would be too boring. Your body is too weak, Grimm muttered in a low voice. Don't tell me your identity as a Witch of Destiny devours your basic stats? Apart from your spiritual force reaching 22 points, which is above the threshold of Grade 2, your other stats are still at Grade 1, and have even dropped a little. My spiritual force has reached 22 points? I thought it was only 21 points. Hee hee, looks like the Scepter of Prophecy really suits me. Don't change the topic. Pay attention to what I'm saying. Grimm rubbed his temples even harder. Based on your body's basic data, I suspect that your special class has a certain energy-absorbing property. What do you mean? In other words, your occupation is inclined towards spiritual force, similar to most elemental magi. Furthermore, your occupation will slowly absorb other attributes to replenish your spiritual force. This will allow you to increase your spiritual force much faster than elemental magi. Alice was undoubtedly very interested in this topic. Doesn't that mean that my mental power is improving much faster than yours? This is a good thing. Don't just look at the benefits. Grimm reprimanded him in annoyance. It will also cause your strength, constitution, and agility to drop. In the end, you will be as weak as a chicken, and your body will be as fragile as a piece of paper, and your speed will be as slow as a snail. So what? Anyway, I'm a Destiny Witch. I just need to point out some things and do some behind-the-scenes work. I'll leave the fighting and killing to you guys. Alice still had an indifferent attitude. No, you're wrong. Grimm shook his head. The Destiny Witches might have tried many ways to increase their mental power. Based on the characteristics of your class, only methods that nourish your spiritual power are the most effective. Even if you use methods that train your strength and build up your physique, the effects won't be great, and there might even be some regression. That's why you've developed the bad habit of focusing only on mental strength. You mean, I made myself very clear. According to the characteristics of your class, you should formulate a more optimized and comprehensive physical fitness improvement plan. Whether it's to nourish the spirit or the body, it'll benefit your spirit. Alice could not help but be surprised. You don't tell me you want me to promote the anatomy wizard among the Destiny Witches? At the thought of a group of delicate Destiny Witches locked in a machine room, sweating and hammering their bodies, soaking in a jar of poison to temper their bodies, Alice felt the world spin, and her future was bleak. Perhaps only Sophia, that big fellow, would like such a life. Grimm clearly guessed what Alice was thinking. He chuckled and said, "As long as you're willing, it's not impossible." "No, I absolutely won't agree." Alice immediately panicked. We can eat, oh. All right. Eating was indeed a way. Oh, right. Other than my physical stats, is there any problem with my advancement this time? Grimm muttered to himself for a moment and could not help but feel distressed. You Destiny Witches have almost abandoned all defensive and combat spells, only keeping a few of your class skills. So I guess that the skills of the Destiny Witches must be very terrifying. Hearing this, Alice closed her eyes and sensed for a moment. After a moment, she finally opened her beautiful eyes. Before becoming a Destiny Witch, I mastered divination. After becoming the leader of the Destiny Witches, I also mastered the ability Fate Perception. This time, I only obtained new ability, Fate Interference. It's very vague and I'm not too sure. Oh, what's its use? It seems. Maybe. Probably. It's to change the fate of a small thing. To use this ability, I need to use 1,500 points of Fate Force. How much Fate Force do you have now? 13,511 points. How can it be so much? Grim could not help but be surprised. I remember you saying that the genius who turned the goblin plane upside down obtained less than 4,000 points of Fate Force. Maybe it's because of this. Alice smiled mysteriously, and with a flip of her slender fingers, an exquisite card the size of a palm appeared out of thin air. The card danced in her tender white fingers, and Grim could clearly see that the card was engraved with a strange and exquisite prophecy scepter. Beep. Strange fate amalgamation detected. Existence. Magic scepter. Sealed. What was fate? Wasn't it supposed to be vague and illusory? How could there be an energy shell that was almost solid? Grim shook his head in distress, deeply confused by the information the AI chip had given him. If Alice could lend him the prophecy scepter to study for a period of time, perhaps he would be able to obtain an answer. But now, Grim could only sigh deeply, shaking his head helplessly with a bitter smile. With his current strength, he was still unable to study such an unfathomable power. Even Alice, the leader of the Witches of Destiny, could only use it according to her instincts. However, she was most likely clueless about the essence and origin of the power of fate. Grim was currently only at the second order, and was still at the stage of using and grasping elemental force. Only after reaching the fourth order and gaining some basic control over the laws of the plane would he be able to continue studying the power of fate. Grim lowered his head and thought for a moment, guessing inwardly. It said that this scepter of prophecy was a semi-divine weapon bestowed by a human god of prophecy in the Fame Plane. Following the fall of the god of prophecy in the war between the humans and the elven gods, the scepter of prophecy fell into the hands of outsiders. The reason you were able to obtain so much power of fate in one go might have something to do with the fall of the god of prophecy. These things are too unfathomable. Let's slowly study them in the future. Right, you just looked at my stats. What about yours and Mary's stats? Alice could not help but ask curiously. Grim smiled and waved his hand. Fire elemental particles quickly gathered and formed lines of words in front of Alice. Grim, mid-grade 2. Profession, elemental magus, fire specialization. Stats, strength 11, 18, vitality 13, 20, agility 10, 8, spirit 26, 29. Note, stats after transformation are in brackets. Profession skills, body of fire, Balrog transformation. Acolyte, fire arrow, fire snake, flaming hand, witchcraft fireball, rank 1. Lava fireball, meteor shower, fire core explosion, flaming storm, flame cage, rank 2. Doomsday volcano, crimson flame storm, inferno wall, meteor fall. Compared to Alice's profession skills, Grim was a tier 2 fire magus with a fire specialization. He had grasped a lot of fire spells, be it the support type flame jet, the defense type lava shield, or the offense type volcano of doom. Grim's densely packed list of skills dazzled Alice's eyes. Her petite cherry lips opened wider and wider. It was difficult for her to close them. Mary, early grade 2. Profession, bloodline magus, vampire. Stats, strength 13, constitution 14, agility 26, spirit 17. Profession skills, embrace acolyte, blood mist, blood bullet, bat transformation, life steal, blood sense, rank 1. Blood contract, blood berserk, blood manipulation, rank 2. Blood corrosion, blood claw, blood boil. Compared to Alice, Mary's stats were practically perfect. In his previous life on Earth, she would have been a superhero on par with Wonder Woman. However, in the Sorcerer World, although Mary was not at the bottom of the Sorcerer World, there was still a huge gap between her and the top of the Sorcerer World. The so-called top of the Sorcerer World was only a tier 4 sorcerer. However, Grim knew very well that even a Tier 4 sorcerer who could dominate the sorcerer world was nothing compared to the great sorcerers who had left the sorcerer world. Great sorcerers who could travel freely in the void, pass through energy storms, search for suitable spaces, and plunder resources were the true core of the sorcerer world. Compared to them, the sorcerers in the sorcerer world were like a group of ants hiding in an ant's nest. Perhaps they were 1 or 2 times bigger. However, in the eyes of the great sorcerers, no matter how big an ant was, it was still an ant. It could not threaten them at all. If an ant jumped around too much, it would only take a finger to destroy it. That was why, even though he had become a Tier 2 sorcerer, Grimm still tried his best to keep a low profile. He did not want to attract the attention of those powerful beings. Chapter 714. Bliss arrived at the Shadow Island a month and a half later than his companions. As the ship crashed into the reefs near the shoreline, a large hole appeared on the starboard side of the ship's bow. An ear-piercing sound came from the bottom of the ship as it scraped against the sand at the bottom of the sea. The slightly fishy seawater gushed in through the hole, and the ship began to tilt. Large amounts of broken planks, wine barrels, and other junk were scattered on the surface of the sea. Bliss turned into a puff of black smoke and flew from the deck of the ship. He crossed nearly 100 meters of the sea and landed heavily on the beach. The moment his feet touched the ground, the beach in front of him bulged silently. Dozens of muscular sand giants with blurry faces surrounded him from all directions. "Tell me your name, intruder." A cold voice came from above him. Bliss raised his head slightly. Through the shadow of his black hood, his 2 large and 2 small green eyes stared at the strange witch who was floating 20 meters above him on a flying broom. Perhaps sensing the familiar ripples of wizard power from the intruder, the pale witch on duty did not command her puppet wizard beasts to continue attacking. "Bliss, a wizard from the Crimson family. I came here with the Witches of Destiny." After not seeing him for a few months, the evil and cruel aura of the worm Lich Bliss had grown thicker. His body under the black robe was much more bloated than before. In a place where the pale, which could not see, the black robe was still wriggling, as if it was not a normal human body. "Bliss!" The witch, floating in the air, took out an inspection crystal and scanned Bliss from afar. The aura she took and matched the aura stored in the crystal. "All right, your identity has been verified. You can enter the island now." But the witch had just finished announcing the results of the inspection when her tone suddenly changed. "The ship you're on is registered with the Wizard's Pagoda on the Shadow Island and is under the protection of the Pale Witches. Now, why can't I sense any signs of life on the ship?" Not far from the beach, the stranded ship was tilted to one side. There were no crew members jumping into the sea to escape, no humans crying for help. Other than the dull thuds of the waves hitting the hull of the ship, everything was eerily silent. "You know, the ship has been sailing for a little longer. I can't really control these little treasures of mine." Blitz shrugged helplessly. With a thud, a pitch-black substance fell out of his black robe and landed on the beach. It rapidly dispersed into thousands of black worms before burrowing back into his robe. "Your reason is not accepted, foreign wizard." A trace of dissatisfaction appeared on the face of the Pale Witch. "You have openly attacked the indigenous organization under the protection of the Pale Witch. You must be punished. 100 magical crystals. We will deduct 100 magical crystals from your planar earnings as punishment. 100 mana crystals? Those were only 37 mortal natives, and they weren't so-called fighters. How could they be so expensive? It's unfriendly for you to treat your allies like this." Suddenly hearing the punishment, Worm Lich Bliss immediately grumbled in dissatisfaction. "Wizard, if you refuse to accept the punishment, I will have to expel you from Shadow Island on behalf of the Pale Witch. It's your choice, accept or reject." The Pale Witch on duty insisted. All right, I'll accept. How dare you guys, who are guarding the rear, treat your allies who are fighting at the front like this? I'll protest to the high-grade witches in your family." Despite his dissatisfaction, Bliss could only choose to accept the punishment. "Follow it. It will bring you into the inner island." Also, your companions have already returned to Shadow Island. You will find them on the 15th level of the Wizard's Pagoda on the Inner Island. After the witch on duty finished speaking, she turned around and flew away on her flying broom. The sand giants surrounding Blitz also dispersed into a pile of sand. Only one sand giant remained, leading Blitz deeper into the island. After leaving the beach, the sand giants dispersed not long after, handing over the guiding task to a shadow mastiff hiding in the shadows. After passing through a small swamp, the new guiding task was handed over to a chaos whiplash. This was a mutant magical plant that resembled a man-eating flower. There was a human face on its sunflower-like flower, and two soft, rattan-like tentacles extended from the middle of its 2-meter-tall stem. The tentacles were covered in terrifying thorns and sticky green liquid. The roots and tentacles under its body split into 2 strands, just like a pair of human legs, moving on the ground in a strange manner. This kind of magical plant was a wizard creation that most wizards like to plant near their residences as sentries and guards. Not only did it have a long life force, it could also hunt for food on its own, so wizards did not have to take care of it every day. Along the way, Blitz had seen many typical wizard beasts and magical plants mentioned in the Wizard's Handbook. Under their guidance, he passed through layers of outer areas and finally entered the inner island after collecting a strange crystal that looked like an identity card. In one of the residences on the 15th level of the Wizard's Pagoda, Blitz met his master, the Great Master who had abandoned him on the Callan continent, the Level 2 Fire Wizard Grimm. Grimm was obviously very happy to see the insect, Lich Blitz, return. After the customary welcome, Grimm tossed a knowledge crystal into Blitz's arms. Everything you've done in the Callan continent was not bad. As a reward for your bravery, this knowledge crystal is yours. This is my personal reward. As for your share as a magus of the family, you can get it from Chef. Alright, if you have nothing else to do, take a good rest on the Shadow Island. I still have a spell experiment that I need to complete immediately. As if racing against time to complete the welcome ceremony, Grimm turned into a ball of flames and disappeared from the room. In the Magus world, even within the same Magus family, there was no such thing as a close relationship between mortals. Everything was based on benefits. It was precisely because the Crimson family could provide them with benefits and knowledge, as well as guide them in their rapid growth, that the ambitious Magi were willing to serve under Grimm. As Grimm's student, Meryl might have some personal feelings for the Crimson family, but the rest of the Magi from the other families were mostly attracted by the benefits and knowledge. That was why the conversations and interactions between Magi were so cold and direct. Knowledge crystal? The insect, Lich Blitz's complicated eyes flickered with suspicion. He casually weighed it in his hand, then tossed the knowledge crystal into the lotus petal-like mouth of the insect, and slid it down its thick neck into its stomach. Oh, it's the poison witchcraft and related knowledge that Poison Centipede Ender had sorted out. He had asked her for these many times, and she had never spilled the beans. Why was she so generous this time? However, he quickly tossed this doubt to the back of his mind. With this poison witchcraft, he would have a new direction in refining and controlling the swarm of insects. In the future, the large swarm of insects he could control would probably be called the Scourge Beetles. As he fantasized, Blitz quickly walked out of Grimm's residence. Just this knowledge crystal that was worth tens of thousands of magic crystals was enough to dispel his previous complaints about being abandoned. He focused all his attention on gathering the necessary poisonous resources and finding suitable ritual items. The Ice Maiden Shefu resided on the 7th level of the Wizard's Pagoda. After finding her and talking to her, Bliss found out what had happened in the family during this period of time. The floating battleship destroyed. Poison Centipede Ender killed in battle. Alice successfully advanced to level 2. Each and every one of these incidents made Bliss tremble with fear. For some reason, he felt that it was not so unacceptable to fight alone in the midst of an enemy's encirclement. Even though they were in the absolute safety of the Shadow Island, the 2 level 1 Magi still trembled in fear at the thought of the terror of a level 4 powerhouse. At the Ice Maiden Shefu's residence, Blitz successfully received a share of the family's rewards. A knowledge crystal that contained the knowledge of another world that his family had seized from the forest elves, a basic material reward of 20,000 magic crystals, 15 elven slaves, level 1 fighters, 3 magical equipment, level 1, 1,000-year tree, core. There were more than a dozen miscellaneous rewards, but what Blitz valued the most were the first 5. Right now, after experiencing the crazy and bloody slaughter and evolution in the Faron Plain, his individual strength had clearly risen to the peak of the first level. He might not even need 3 to 5 years to think about advancing to level 2 after returning to the Magus world. Blitz could directly collect some of the smaller rewards from Shefu, but rewards like the elven slaves, magical equipment, and 1,000-year tree core had to be collected from the public storage area of the Wizard's Pagoda. After bidding farewell to Shefu, Blitz could only run to the 3rd level of the Wizard's Pagoda. Strictly speaking, this was a slave and equipment market that the Wizard's Pagoda had set up to store and collect the spoils of war of individual witches or families. Compared to the cold and quiet levels of the other levels, the hustle and bustle here exceeded Blitz's expectations. There was a bustling crowd, all sorts of clothing and races, all kinds of strange products, as well as dazzling signboards and shops. Chapter 7:15. Perhaps it was Bliss's eye-catching black robe that had some effect. A handsome young man with dark skin ran up to Bliss and bowed. "Lord Sorcerer, may I know where you wish to go? Bill is willing to serve you." Bliss's green eyes scanned the area, and he asked in a strange native language, "How do you know I'm a wizard?" But it was no wonder that he was surprised, for there were many others like him in this vast and noisy marketplace, and almost all of them were wrapped up in thick robes or traveler's cloaks, so that not an inch of skin could be seen. Under such circumstances, a weak native youth was able to recognize his identity as a wizard. This was clearly out of Bliss's expectations. The native youth was slightly taken aback, then bowed with a strange expression. "Sir, mortals like us who are allowed to enter the Wizard's Pagoda have to wear this." With the native youth's guidance, Bliss realized that there was a strange brooch pinned to his chest. Bliss looked around and found a similar brooch on everyone's chest. Closing his eyes, he could faintly feel the faint ripples of wizard spells emanating from the brooch. So that's it. Only wizards did not have to follow these security measures set for the mortals of the outside world. "So, I want to go to the slave market of the Pale Witches. Take me there." "This way, sir." As the owner of the Wizard's Pagoda, the slave market of the Pale Witches was undoubtedly located in the most eye-catching place on the 3rd level of the Wizard's Pagoda. The area it occupied was almost half of the entire 3rd level. Almost all of the captives that the witches had captured were locked up here, waiting to be sent back to the wizard world when the dimension door opened. But considering the entrance fee needed to pass through the dimension door, not all of the slaves would be taken away. The Dark Witches had captured more than 400 forest elves from the Kalan continent in one go. There were old and young among them, and the ratio was not small. But no matter how powerful they were, the basic cost to pass through the dimension door was 100 magic crystals. An ordinary elf, even if transported back to the wizard world, would only be worth 20 to 30 magic crystals in the wizard world's market. But elves with special skills, or elven fighters, were several times more expensive than ordinary elves. Hence, if it wasn't necessary, no one would be willing to spend such an unwarranted amount of money to transport a bunch of losers back to the Magus world. In the 6 months that the Crimson family had been in the Kalan continent, they had also captured more than 600 forest elves. If all of them were to be transported back to the sorcerer world, not only would they not be able to earn back the travel expenses, they would also have to fork out a large sum of money. Therefore, the ordinary elves and the old, weak, and sick elven warriors would be eliminated and put into the Ashen Witches' slave market to be sold to the natives of the Faron Plain. Only those who were carefully selected were worth the Crimson family spending a sum of magic crystals to bring them back. And as a reward from the family, Billis could pick out 15 elves from the Crimson family's capture for his own personal collection. They could be auctioned off or used as experimental materials. All the profits would belong to the wizard. It was because of Grimm's generosity that the wizards of the family were willing to brave great risks and fight with him in different planes. Walking into the shop opened by the Pale Witch, the first thing he saw was a row of old wooden cages lined up along the huge stone wall. Inside the wooden cages were slaves from another plane, some sitting, some lying, and some lying down. The wooden cages were not big, only about 10 square meters, but they were tightly packed with slaves and captives of different races, skin colors, and genders. There were Highland dwarves who were good at mining and smelting, kobolds who were good at digging and digging, ogre wizards who were up to 5 meters tall with 2 heads on their necks, and flame-tailed lions with fiery red fur and bright yellow flames burning on their tails. Of course, there were also forest elves who had been captured from the Callan continent. Seeing Billis walk in, a group of enthusiastic young girls surrounded him, speaking in the sorcerer's language that was not very familiar with. They attentively served this mysterious wizard who was hidden in a black robe. The native youth who had brought Billis here was pushed to the side with an awkward expression. Now that he was here, it was not his place to speak. "I'm here to collect my family's reward. This is the number plate." Billis took out a bronze plate and tossed it in his hand. "This is the Crimson family's mark plate. Their captives are all locked up in District 13's 25 to 41 wooden prison. Luna, take him there." An old magus who was reading a book behind a wooden table rolled her eyes, but only glanced at it once before paying no more attention. A young girl immediately left to carry out the order. District 13 was located in the center of the huge market. It was obvious that there were many slave leaders and representatives of the merchant guilds gathered here, and their arguments were especially intense. If it wasn't for the fact that fighting was forbidden in the market, some of the people who couldn't come to an agreement would have already started fighting. It had to be said that war was the best shortcut to getting rich. For the powerful nobles of the Faron continent, there were not many opportunities to obtain the specialties of the Callan continent. Although large numbers of slave ships would secretly head to the Callan continent every year, due to the storms in the sea, the raiding of the sea folk, and the existence of the elven patrols, the number of ships that could successfully return to the Faron continent could be counted on one hand. Given the extravagant nature of the nobles, they were extremely infatuated with the exotic forest elves. Thus, in the Faron continent, the price of forest elves, regardless of gender, was extremely high. Thus, among the many captives, a powerful grade 1 ogre might not even be worth as much as a young and beautiful acolyte female elf. When a young girl brought Bliss to a stop in front of a row of wooden cages, the magus could clearly see the emblem of the Crimson family's flaming hand on the thick, old pillars of the wooden cages. Within the wooden cages were densely packed forest elves, their eyes spitting flames of fury. Amongst them, there was not a single one that was too old or weak. They were all young elves with graceful figures and delicate faces. However, without exception, their shoulders were all branded with a circular magic brand, isolating them from elemental energy. Coupled with the effects of the enfeeblement spell, all of the elves looked sickly. They no longer had the nimbleness and agility they had when they climbed up and down the 100-meter-tall trees in the magic forest, as if they were walking on flat ground. Bliss's arrival had obviously attracted the attention of the merchants who were choosing their goods in front of the wooden cages. Seeing Bliss's strange attire, the more observant fellows all moved to the side, giving up the best spot in front of the wooden cages. Bliss walked around the Crimson family's wooden slave cages a few times and found that there were not many ordinary elves within. 600 grade 1 elven warriors was a significant loss to the elven kingdom. There were no grade 2 elves, of course. This was almost certain. Such valuable grade 2 elves would not be locked in such a crude and vile environment. They would definitely be gathered in a higher class place. Among these grade 1 elven warriors, there were muscular sword dancers with elven battle tattoos all over their exposed skin, as well as elven archers with lithe bodies and nimble limbs. As for the elves with special abilities, such as elven wizards, druids, elven beast tamers, they were picked out and locked in a few adjacent wooden cages. To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that the Callan continent's insect armies could not be brought back to the Magus world, Bliss would have settled down there and slowly devoured the forest elves. As an insect wizard, his physical strength was still on the weak side, and he did not have many powerful spells to use. Almost all battles were settled by the insect swarms and insect soldiers. This could allow him to defeat the strong, and he could grind down the powerful creatures that were far stronger than him. However, it did not bring much benefit to his individual strength. Hence, Bliss could only strive to find a balance between the growth of the insect swarms and his own strength. The most ambitious and crazy idea in his mind was to occupy a material plane with rich resources and many creatures, and then turn all the creatures there into his insect swarms, taking all the resources for himself. When that time came, he would become the master of the insect swarms that ruled over tens of thousands of planes, a great insect wizard that many magi looked up to. Unfortunately, after experiencing a few consecutive planar wars, the cruel reality made him understand that it was a fool's dream to achieve this with his mere grade 1 strength. Hence, for greater development in the future, he gave up on the 100,000 insect armies that he had painstakingly gathered in the Callan continent. He brought some of the elites and all the insect soldiers and resolutely returned to the Magus faction. At this moment, what kind of elves he would choose became a problem that required deep consideration. Ordinary elven warriors could only be used to incubate insect swarms, and only elves with elemental power were suitable to cultivate insect soldiers. Hence, Bliss focused most of his attention on the elven wizards and druids. Just as he was pondering over what to choose, a burly slave leader plucked up his courage and moved to Bliss' side. "Sir, I wonder if you're willing to sell your elf quota to us? We're willing to pay a high price, and..." The slave leader lowered his voice and said, "We can get you something that might interest you." "Something that I'm interested in?" Bliss sneered in a hoarse voice. "What do you mortals have that can satisfy me of?" "Sir, this is the list of items we brought this time. Why don't you take a look first?" With that, the head slave carefully fished out an ancient sheepskin scroll from his bosom and silently unfurled it in front of Bliss. Bliss glanced at it, and the insect leader hidden in the shadow of his hood could not help but be slightly stunned. Chapter 716. The nightmare flower was an extremely rare magic plant. Because its petals and branches are bright red, it is often transplanted by people who do not know why it is in their own gardens or homes. Never in their wildest dreams would they have imagined that they had invited a flower of death that could kill without leaving a trace. The nightmare flower could slowly absorb the spiritual force of living beings around it, causing them to become mentally exhausted. If it was a regular person, they would often be tired and have nightmares in their sleep, which was why it was called a nightmare flower. As the nightmare flower absorbed divine force through a spiritual force field, and the process was very slow, regular people who were being absorbed would not be able to sense it at all. Hence, those who lusted after its beauty and transplanted it near their residences would eventually die of mental exhaustion for unknown reasons. Of course, such low-grade magic plants would not be able to cause any harm to magi. After all, with magi's acute spiritual force, they could easily sense the strange spiritual force field of the nightmare flower. According to what Bliss knew, the nightmare flower that continuously absorbed the spiritual force of humans for 10 years could be used to concoct a special speed thought potion. This speed thought potion was a rank 2 potion even in the Magus world, and could continuously replenish spiritual force for half an hour. If he could drink a bottle of the speed thought potion before advancing to a rank 2 Magus, the difficulty of breaking through would definitely be much lower. Hence, when he saw the name Flower of Misfortune on the list of items, Bliss was slightly startled. He could not help but reach out with his strange pincer, using the sharp tip of his pincer to lift the sheepskin scroll, and whispered, "What does this Flower of Misfortune look like? Describe it to me." Seeing that there was a chance, the burly slave immediately leaned over in a fawning manner. He did not seem to mind Bliss's non-human pincer at all, and used a fawning voice to describe the appearance age, and quality of the flower of misfortune in detail. After listening to the description, the Lich Bliss immediately muttered to himself. To be honest, he did not have much hope before asking. After all, this was the famed plane, not the Magus world. Though the names of the two flowers were similar, they could be two completely different magic plants in different planes. However, through Leyland's description, Bliss was certain that the misfortune flower that grew in Faerun was the rarer nightmare flower in the Magus world. Of course, the Faerun dimension also had a large number of spellcasters, so they had also discovered the strange characteristics of a magic plant like the Doom Flower. However, the alchemy system of the Faerun plane was far less developed than that of the Sorcerer world, and it was difficult to extract the spiritual force from the Flower of Misfortune through effective means. Hence, in the Magus world, a single nightmare flower was worth 6,000 magic crystals, but in the Faerun plane, it was only a supplementary alchemy material. Its base value was around 200 to 300 magic crystals. Perhaps it was because of the scarcity of flowers of misfortune and the difference in their names that the Pale Witches did not discover them. Otherwise, such a good thing would never have fallen into Blitz's lap. Without hesitation, Bliss pulled the slave leader to a corner and started a half-serious, half-fake discussion. Although the slave leader saw that this batch of flowers of misfortune seemed to be more important to the other party, he still did not ask for too much out of consideration. After a round of haggling, Bliss transferred his quota of 15 elven slaves to the slave leader, while the other party took out 4 stalks of misfortune flowers that were all older than 20 years. After successfully stowing the 4 stalks of misfortune flowers into his waist pouch, all that was left was for the other party to choose the elven slaves. The other party had obviously already chosen the goods here, and very quickly picked out the elven slaves that he liked. His choice was even more out of Bliss's expectations. If Bliss were to choose, he would definitely choose those with high elemental affinity and powerful abilities. However, the slave leader had chosen all Grade 1 combatants, and their occupations included archers, wizards, and druids. But he had actually given up on the few high-grade elves and chose the beginner-grade ones instead. Bliss's green eyes scanned the elves many times, and he was shocked to discover that the elves that the other party had chosen were not the strongest, but those graceful and tall bodies, those well-proportioned bodies, and those youthful and beautiful faces. The elves' slender and gentle beauty were all vividly displayed. After choosing the slaves, the native young lady waved a crystal rod and removed the protective spell formation of the wooden cages. She unlocked the door and chased the selected elves out one by one. The elves in the wooden cages immediately cried and cursed, and the entire scene turned into a mess. However, under the dual effects of the sealing spell and the weakening spell, the elves that had once dominated the illusory magic forest were now soft-footed crabs. The native young lady was at best an ordinary person, and her muscles were not strong enough. However, when she was angry, she could casually fling a sword dancer who was wielding an elven saber and carving flowers to the ground. Looking at the elves who were once invincible in the past, only to be reduced to weaklings at the mercy of others, an indescribable sadness and sorrow made all of the elves burst into tears. Not only did the people present not feel the slightest bit of sympathy for the cries of the weak, they instead laughed heartily, taking pleasure in their misfortune. After the transaction was completed, Bliss did not leave immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the other slave leaders and representatives of the Merchant Association. Since you're here, why don't you take out whatever good stuff you have for me to see? The transaction between the insect, Lich Bliss, and the slave leader had long since caused a few of his companions to feel an unbearable itch. They immediately swarmed over and took out the transaction list that they had meticulously prepared. However, after Bliss's careful sweep, he really did find 2 rare materials that he was interested in, the red scale monarch bug and the dragon poison potion. The former was a strange bug with tough red scales, while the latter was a type of highly toxic potion. Even though he could not confirm their effects for the time being, collecting and studying them could be beneficial to Bliss's insect army in the future. These rare materials had either been overlooked by the Pale Witches, or they did not care about such small profits. Since they had somehow fallen into Bliss's hands, he naturally would not let them go so easily. Bliss spent the rest of his time in the slave market. Not only did he happily trade away his family's rewards, he even spent more than half of the 20,000 magic crystals he had just gotten. What he got in return was a large number of exotic plants, as well as some strange bugs and poisonous ants. Bliss had never felt so strongly before. Conquering in other dimensions was indeed the best shortcut to getting rich. Just as Bliss was indulging in the joy of treasuring in another dimension, Grimm, the leader of the Crimson family, was receiving a mysterious guest in the Wizard's Pagoda. To be honest, even Grimm did not expect that he would have an acquaintance visiting him in another dimension. "Lord Arms, I didn't expect you to still be in the Faron dimension." Grimm was surprised as he sat in his residence, leisurely tasting the fragrant wine in his hand. The newcomer removed the hood on his head, revealing a head full of blue hair that was densely covered in lightning and flickering sparks. Coupled with his handsome and robust face, he gave off an oppressive feeling of power without being angry. It was the level 3 Thunder Dragon Arms. Arms stood proudly and glanced around with his strange amber eyes. "You wizards are indeed the most powerful spellcasters in the multiverse. You can build such a powerful magic structure even in a foreign world." Arms clicked his tongue and said, "You wizards are indeed the most powerful spellcasters in the multiverse. No wonder you could survive the attacks of the natives." Grimm did not know whether to laugh or cry as he listened to Arms flattering him. "Lord Arms, we're old acquaintances who have worked together many times. If you have any requests, I'll do my best to help." To be honest, the level 3 Thunder Dragon had taken a huge risk to visit Grimm in disguise. Where's this? This was a wizard tower guarded by a level 4 witch. No matter how powerful the grade 3 Thunder Dragon was, once it attracted the attention of the witch in the tower, she could capture it alive in minutes and make it her own way. That was why he would not dare to step into the wizard's tower if he did not have confidence in Grimm. Last time, he had been completely sealed, and Grimm had not done anything to him. This time, he was in someone else's wizard tower. Even if Grimm betrayed the Thunder Dragon, he would not be the one to benefit the most. Arms was even more certain that Grimm would not betray him. However, as a rank 3 dragon, asking a rank 2 magus for help, this was a little hard to say. "Oh, I heard that in half a month, you'll be opening the dimension door to return to the wizard world?" Arms had said a simple sentence, but it was unclear. But Grimm still understood what he was saying. "That's right. The dimension door will open in 14 days. Grimm looked at Arms in surprise. "Do you want to go to the wizard world with us, Lord?" It was no wonder that Grimm was so surprised. The day the dimension door opened was when the witches were most vigilant. No matter how good the level 3 Thunder Dragon transformation spell was, it would be difficult to sneak through. Grimm had summoned the grade 3 Thunder Dragon from Lance Plane to Faron Plane. If it wanted to go back, it could easily teleport back using the power of the contract. Why would it need to go through the sorcerer world? "Don't worry, Lord. If you want to go to Lance Realm, I might be able to help you." "What if there are too many people?" "Oh, 11 dragons. Can you help me transport them back to Lance?" Chapter 717. After a series of questions, Grimm finally understood why the Thunder Dragon Arms was still in the Faron Plane. He had barged into the Dragon's Cliff and abducted 11 powerful dragons from the Forest Dragons. Grimm's mouth twitched when he heard this. The muscles on his face twitched, and he felt the urge to throw his head back and laugh out loud. He didn't think that his random move would cause the forest elves to suffer such a huge loss. Grimm, who had suffered so much at the hands of the Elven Sword Master, felt extremely satisfied and satisfied. The current situation was clear. Arms had abducted 11 dragons of different ranks, but he didn't have the ability to bring them back to the Lance Plane. It would be easy for Arms to return a lance on his own, but it would be impossible for him to take the 11 dragons with him. Left with no other choice, Arms could only turn his attention to the only Tier 2 wizard he knew. 11 dragons. Among them, there was 1 Tier 3 dragon, 3 Tier 2 dragons, and 7 Tier 1 dragons. Such an alluring giant dragon battle team was actually introduced by him, and now it had fallen into someone else's pocket. At this moment, Grimm's feelings were extremely complicated. His young and handsome face even had an expression of not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Hence, when Grimm heard Arm's question, he was momentarily at a loss for words. "We can promise you, Lord Arms." A crisp female voice suddenly sounded from the side. "We can guarantee that you and your dragon subordinates will arrive at the Lance Plains safely. However, the teleportation fees..." The Type 3 Thunder Dragon's eyes widened in disbelief as it stared at Alice, who had suddenly appeared in the room. "Tier 2. Even you're a Tier 2. The Thunder Dragon couldn't help but mutter. Dragons and wizards were creatures of 2 different dimensions. The giant dragon race had a long life force and powerful individual strength. The dragon race's inheritance was even more enviable. That was why they had a completely different outlook on life. To dragons, 100 years was too short. A few naps, and it would pass without a sound. However, to those with short lifespans, 100 years was more than half of their lives. Dragons rarely made friends with humans. It wasn't that they didn't want to, but it was unnecessary. To be honest, humans who were powerful enough to stand on equal footing with the giant dragons were usually in the twilight of their lives. To make friends with such a fellow, perhaps in the time it took for a dragon to sleep, the other party would have died of old age long ago. Even the corpse under the soil would have become a pile of unrecognizable bones. Although the sorcerers were powerful, they also inherited many of the flaws of humans. Even those rank 4 magi would find it hard to compete with a dragon in terms of lifespan. Perhaps it was because of the short lifespan that the wizards grew at an astonishing speed and efficiency. 2 months ago, when they last met, Alice was still a dying person whose life force was about to completely disappear. But this time, the other party had actually become a Tier 2 divine warrior. Not only that, but whenever Arms gazed at Alice's youthful body and face, he would feel a little uneasy. It was as if her delicate body contained something that even he had to revere. "Did you absorb the quasi-relic?" Arms asked out of the blue. Now, even the Grade 2 Green Dragon August had become his subordinate. Arms had a certain understanding of what Grimm and Alice had done in the past. "Not yet. I only absorbed a little." As her life force flowed back into her, Alice's beautiful face and perfect figure were restored. At the same time, even her spiritual force field was filled to the brim. At this moment, let alone having a spiritual connection with her, just seeing her sweet smile would make one's mood improve. Weak beings wouldn't even be able to sense that their minds were being controlled. Only a Tier 3 divine warrior like Arms could sense the strange intimacy that came with Alice's words, figure, and aura. Creature affinity. Arms couldn't help but frown. Unbeknownst to him, Alice's overflowing spiritual power also carried a trace of biological affinity power. Only a Tier 3 divine warrior like Arms could sense and resist the influence of this affinity, but for those weaker than him, the moment they saw Alice, they couldn't help but think of her as one of their own. This also meant that those who couldn't resist Alice's affinity would never take the initiative to attack her. This was a good way to protect themselves. However, even if Alice advanced, she would still be a weak little witch in front of a Tier 3 Thunder Dragon. Arms quickly broke free from Alice's phantom affinity. Only then did he remember what she had said. "Do you have a way to send 11 dragons to Lance? Tell me, how much will it cost? As you know, we'll have to deal with those Grade 4 witches through the planar gate. That's why I have to spend some energy to conceal their dragon aura. I'll only charge you 200,000 magic crystals. 200,000 mana crystals? That's not much. I'll pay for it." To be honest, this was actually the most difficult part of the smuggling operation. Trying to sneak 11 dragons through the planar gate under the noses of a group of high-ranked witches was as difficult as a successful ogre becoming a thief and successfully stealing a dragon's treasure. With the unique smell and elemental aura of dragons, Even if they were separated by 8 to 10 miles, it would still be impossible to hide from a high-ranked witch's mental perception. Moreover, more than half of the 11 dragons were Grade 1 green dragons, and they didn't have the strength to conceal their aura. Hence, if Arms and his group of dragons barged into the planar gate on the day it opened to the public, the Pale, Tier 4, which would capture him alive and flay his tendons. But before Arms could agree to it with a smile, Alice continued her sentence. Crossing the planar gate costs 10,000 magic crystals for a Grade 1 dragon, 20,000 for a Grade 2 dragon, and 50,000 for a Grade 3 dragon. So expensive? Arms' expression stiffened, but he forced a smile. All right, no problem. Unfortunately, Alice wasn't done yet. Teleporting from the Witch Union headquarters to the Tower of Destiny will cost the same. Arms couldn't even force a smile anymore. Teleporting from the Tower of Destiny to the Lance Plane will cost the same. This time, Arms' expression turned completely ashen, his strange vertical pupils filled with anger and humiliation. The total cost of teleporting was already close to 1,000,000 magic crystals. Even as a Grade 3 Dragon Lord, Arms couldn't afford such a frightening cost. This was like forcing a dragon to hang itself. But considering Sir Arms' financial situation, we can accept payment in installments or as collateral. Of course, if Sir Arms is willing to join the Crimson Clan, we can immediately have the cost. Alice smiled sweetly at Arms. Her smile was as sweet as an angel's, but the Tier 3 Thunder Dragon could clearly see a pair of demonic wings behind her back. I will never bow down to the weak. This is the unwavering will of our dragon race. Arms roared with a proud expression, even though he had been forced into a corner. That's a pity. Alice's smile didn't change. Since you and your subordinates aren't members of the Thunder Dragon family, you won't be able to enjoy the half-price discount. So, Great Thunder Dragon, how do you plan to pay for the teleportation? Ugh. Just a moment ago, Arms had been wearing a proud and unyielding expression on his face. Yet in the next moment, he had completely deflated. For the first time in 2 months, he couldn't help but feel regret for the number of dragons he had kidnapped. If only the number of green dragons following him was a little less, perhaps he would face less financial pressure. 1,000,000 magic crystals. That's 1,000,000 magic crystals. If he really had 1,000,000 magic crystals, he wouldn't have to go through so much trouble to rob those poor goblins. For the past 2 months, Arms had been wandering around the Farron Plain with the little emerald female dragon, immersing himself in the admiration of his subordinates. Before this, Arms had been feeling proud of his powerful charm, but now he was filled with endless regret and annoyance. With the dragon's habit of accumulating wealth, he should be able to make up for this huge gap if he borrowed some money from the little emerald female dragon. But when he thought of Aretina's bashful expression of admiration, Arms couldn't help but hesitate. The stinginess of the dragons was as well known as their lustful nature. Putting himself in her shoes, if he was Aladina and found out that the guy she liked was eyeing her treasure, he would probably turn hostile in the next moment. No, I can't get any ideas from Aretina. Maybe I should ask the other dragon subordinates to pay for the teleportation? But if I do that, I'm afraid that the dragons I just roped in will become disloyal. Arms, who had been arrogant and domineering just a moment ago, immediately turned into a young dragon that hated the world. He gritted his teeth for a long time, but still couldn't make a decision. Lord Arms, if you have any decent treasures or strange items, we can also pay for them. Wishful thinking. You evil creatures. Don't ever think of coveting my treasure. Arms was like a cigarette that would ignite at the slightest touch. The moment someone tried to lay their hands on his treasure, he would instantly go crazy. Then, Lord Arms, I have a plan here. I wonder if you would be willing to listen to it. At this moment, Grim could clearly smell a conspiracy from the sweet smile on Alice's face. Chapter 718. On the opening day of the Planar Gate. After 8 months of killing in the Otherworld, the factions of the Northern Witches had also returned to the Shadow Island one after another. Those who had not returned by this time would probably never be able to return. There was always a loss for every gain. Even for the witches who had returned, their teams had shrunk to varying degrees. The Dark Witches lost 2 people, the Death Witches lost 1, and the Winter Witches lost 1. Secretly counting, except for the Destiny Witches who lost 4 people, some of which were seriously injured, the losses of the other factions were mostly between 1 or 2 people. However, the Destiny Witches were still not the ones who suffered the most. Surprisingly, almost all of the sham witches who had chosen to go to the Ocean Empire had died. Only the Tier 3, which had managed to escape and return to the Ocean Empire. However, looking at her appearance, there was not much sadness on her face, so she should have successfully completed the mission. You get what you pay. The witches of the various factions suffered losses, but their gains were also abundant. Chests after chests of rare treasures, cages of magical beasts, rows of non-humankind slaves, and bulging purses and storage rings. Although the death of their companions was sad, the remaining witches had gained experience through the planar expedition and successfully collected a lot of otherworld resources. It had to be said that the major wizard organizations used this method to achieve the survival of the fittest and select the internal elites. At the same time, it also effectively tilted the increasingly rare wizard resources to the hands of the strong. Of course, the real gains of the major witch factions would never be announced, and they were carefully and cleverly hidden. The only things that could be spied on by outsiders were the slaves and magical beasts that could not be hidden. The Winter Witches, the Pale Witches, the Death Witches, the Pain Witches, and the Deception Witches chose to attack the human kingdoms. So the slaves and magical beasts they brought back were also of a variety, covering almost all the creatures in the magical encyclopedia of the Faron Continent. The Dark Witches and the Destiny Witches went to the Elven Kingdom, so the harvest was all forest elves and natural magical beasts of various ranks. In particular, the Dark Witches seemed to have gone crazy and actually brought back more than 400 forest elves in one breath. There were old and young among them, and it seemed to be a relatively complete tribe. Transporting so many elven slaves back to the sorcerer world would probably cost millions of magic crystals. Such a big move made all the witches secretly shocked, and they could not help but start to guess the reason why the other party did this. In comparison, they had lost half of their manpower in exchange for Leader Alice's promotion from Tier 1 to Tier 2. This did not seem to be worth it, but considering that the Destiny Witches had just been revived and all their hopes were pinned on Alice, it was not surprising that she made such a choice. On the other hand, the Witches of Destiny's capture was not very eye-catching. 50 carefully selected elven captives and more than 30 nature-type magical beasts. This kind of harvest could only be considered to be passable. Moreover, he didn't know what these Destiny Witches were thinking. They actually mixed a dozen stinky, 3-headed snake lizards with the spoils of war. Although the 3-headed snake lizard was rare in the sorcerer's world, it was not unique. As long as he was willing to put in the effort and search the Black Forest, he would definitely be able to capture it. But the Destiny Witches were actually willing to spend such an expensive ticket to bring these guys with only beginner level 1 strength back to the sorcerer's world. It was as if they were afraid that having too many magic crystals would burn their hands. But these were all minor details. What really attracted the attention of the witches was the hypocritical witch who escaped alone. She was purely alone, with not a single spoil of war or a single captive. The situation was as awkward as it could get. Seeing this situation, a few of the leading Tier 3 witches could not help but approach her to communicate. Unfortunately, no matter how much they probed and teased her, they could not figure out what the other party's mission was. Just as the group of witches had gathered at the giant teleportation plaza on the inner island and were discussing this matter, the wizard's pagoda that stood tall within the volcano trembled slightly. It shot out a blinding white light, then slowly tore open a space fissure with violent energy surging within it. The huge wizard formation hidden under the teleportation plaza also began to operate. A mysterious and profound life formation composed of pure magical energy slowly emerged and began to rotate slowly with the torn space fissure as the center. Two tall, strange giants suddenly appeared on both sides of the space fissure and roared. They grabbed the edge of the fissure with their hands and pulled it wider. When the space fissure opened to a width of 30 meters, the two giants roared and instantly turned into two tall golden doors, firmly stabilizing the space fissure. Hurry up and go through. There's a lot of flesh and blood of creatures like the cloud giants. This space gate can only last for a quarter of an hour. Hurry up. Under the urging of the leading pale, the team of witches who had already counted the number of people in advance and paid the ticket finally began to move forward slowly. Whether it was people or objects or the otherworld magical beasts imprisoned in the metal cages, they were instantly sucked into the space gate and disappeared without a trace when they touched it. The cries and screams of the captives and the team became louder. Perhaps they had already realized that after crossing this light gate, what awaited them was no longer the familiar world, people, and things that they were familiar with. Their former companions and relatives would also be written off, and they would never have the chance to see them again. Wizard World, Vilnan. The location of the Witch Council. The strange phenomenon caused by the vibration of the void plane had not completely dissipated. Inside the huge light gate in the teleportation hall, layers of ripples in the space kept trembling. Every time it trembled, a number of strange creatures would be spat out from it. These captives and magical beasts who had never experienced interplane long-distance teleportation were all lying in the cages with a weak look on their faces. It was obvious that they were undergoing the baptism of the wizard world's plane law. Those who were slightly weaker opened their mouths and panted desperately. Every breath they took was as difficult as going through a life and death battle. On the contrary, when all the witches and wizards stepped out of the light gate, they all seemed to be in high spirits. The surrounding void continuously surged with a comfortable and gentle aura, like the warm embrace of a mother, causing the witches and wizards present to involuntarily be intoxicated, their souls floating. This was actually a normal phenomenon after wizards returned from the otherworld. After all, the wizard world was the place where the origin of their souls were placed and branded. Only in this place could they display 100% of their strength. In the otherworld, however, they would always be in a state of suppression and rejection. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, and transport these captives out to recuperate. These elves are too delicate. If we don't hurry up and take care of them, most of them will die here. Under the series of commands from the leading witch, the tall wizard beasts that had been waiting at the periphery of the teleportation hall rushed in and helped the witches carry the spoils of war and slaves out. Alice, who was dressed in a purple starry robe, stretched out her hand to stop the witches and wizard beasts in front of her. We don't need your help with our spoils of war. Tell your manager to hurry up and activate the teleportation formation. We want to return directly to the Tower of Destiny. Hearing this, the witches were completely dumbfounded. What? Teleport back to the Tower of Destiny? Was this Alice crazy? No matter how many spoils of war and slaves she brought back, it would only cost a few thousand magic crystals to hire a caravan to transport them back to the Tower of Destiny. But if they were to use the teleportation formation, they would probably need tens of thousands of magic crystals. Just as the witches were in a state of shock, another witch stood out. Activate the teleportation formation. I also need to return directly to the clan. The witches looked over and saw that it was the only remaining grade 3 witch of deception. It seemed that there was something strange going on between the two witch teams, which was why they were worried about any undue delay and wanted to immediately return to their clan. Regarding such a request, the Ceticilia family, who was responsible for protecting Wilning, naturally had no reason to refuse. Soon, after the rest of the witch teams left the teleportation hall, the teleportation formation here began to operate slowly. Tong following two muffled sounds, the Witches of Destiny and the Witch of Deception disappeared in the teleportation formation one after another. Hurry up, carry this, and this out for me. Under the command of Sophia and Shave, the witch apprentices who had long received the news swarmed forward. either using levitation spells or commanding their wizard beasts to carry the boxes of spoils of war out of the teleportation formation. They had only carried out 1/3 of the spoils of war and captives they had brought back. The rest of the boxes and wooden cages were already placed in the teleportation formation, including the cages that held a dozen or so three-headed snake scorpions. This time, the Witches of Destiny have lost a lot of power. I might need some time to rearrange the affairs here. I'll leave the matters over there to you. Alice stood outside the teleportation formation, waving at Grim. The situation over at Lance is very troublesome. You have to be careful. Immediately after, a white light rose up and enveloped the entire teleportation formation. When the blinding white light dissipated, there was nothing left in the room. Lance Plain, Metal Fortress. As a dazzling white light overflowed from the teleportation formation, many figures suddenly appeared on the teleportation platform. Smelling the familiar and intimate smell of the plane, the Thunder Dragon Arms, who had been disguised as a three-headed snake lizard by the baleful polymorph spell, roared and broke free from the illusion on its body. It smashed the wooden cage with its head and began to roar and stretch its body. Following suit, the rest of the giant dragons broke out of their cages one after another, roaring as they restored their bodies. Chapter 719. Welcome back, my master. A slightly muffled voice suddenly came from his side. What's up with these dragons? Have they become your slaves? All right, Gavin, we'll talk about these things later. Why don't you tell me about the situation in Lance while I was away? Grim quickly interrupted the brain monster and successfully changed the topic. Ugh, master, the situation here maybe isn't too good. Gazlu stuttered, as if he had something he couldn't say. Before Grim could ask, he felt the ground beneath him tremble, and the mountain on top of the dome began to shake inexplicably. Following that, a loud dragon's roar came through the thick rock and metal walls, reverberating above the empty metal fortress. The dragons were attacking the metal fortress? Grim's brows furrowed again. Master, ever since you left the metal fortress, those dragons have been attacking this place with all their might, as if they've gone mad. They would come here once every 2 or 3 days, and there would be 6 to 7 of them each time. They're also at Grade 1, Grade 2, and Grade 3. It seems like they're trying to outlast us. With a pillar of support, the Grade 3 brain monster Gazlu immediately went into complaining mode. He could tell that it had been tortured by the uninvited flying lizards over the past few days. Let me see what's happening outside, Grim said in a deep voice. Lance was a rare dragon's treasure trove. There weren't just dragons inside, but moving magic crystal mountains. So no matter what, he would not give up on this forward operating base and this safe metal fortress. Under such circumstances, the safety of the metal fortress was undoubtedly his greatest concern. A metal platform slowly rose from the floor in front of Grim. A white crystal inlaid on the platform projected a huge screen of light, showing the situation outside the metal fortress in full view. It could be seen that the screen was at the top of a mountain a dozen miles away. From this angle, he could clearly see everything that was happening outside the metal fortress. On the screen, outside the mountain where the metal fortress was located, 7 dragons were flapping their wings and soaring in the blue sky. They raised their necks and let out loud dragon roars that shook the heavens and earth. From time to time, a dragon would suddenly fold its wings and swoop down, shooting dozens of energy rays against the metal fortress, using a terrifying dragon flame to wash the rock and metal walls. This black flame was like a thick pillar of fire. As the dragon's head moved left and right, it swept out a huge fan. The sticky black flame with strong adhesion constantly washed the rock walls of the mountain, and the extreme temperature quickly melted the rocks. In the blink of an eye, the rock walls that the dragon flame swept past flowed down like molten copper, revealing the dark golden metal wall below. With Gazlu guarding the metal fortress, of course, it would not sit and wait. Terrifying energy rays shot out like dense lines of fire. Even with the tough scales and high magic resistance of a dragon, it was difficult to defend against magic attacks of this degree. He only had time to breathe once before a series of bloody holes appeared on the huge body of the swooping dragon. Large amounts of dragon blood splashed out and instantly dyed the dragon a blood dragon. The dragon felt the pain and let out a mournful roar. It flapped its wings frantically and struggled to escape the attack range of the energy rays. Grimm could not help but sigh inwardly. Only a dragon could do this. If it were any other monster, they would have long been pierced through by the dense rain of energy rays with an attack power of up to 210 degrees. How could they possibly take such a terrifying attack and escape? That should have been a Tier 1 dragon. If even it could survive the bombardment of the metal fortress, then those Tier 2 dragons, before Grimm could finish his thoughts, what he was worried about happened. Seeing that one of its companions was injured, a Tier 2 dragon actually let out a long roar and grabbed a terrifying boulder that weighed half a ton from a nearby mountain peak. It struggled to fly up, then folded its wings and swooped down at high speed. Seeing that the situation was bad, a dozen or so pitch-black cannons stretched out of the metal fortress and gathered a dazzling magic light before firing rapidly at the diving dragon. It was like watching a high-definition magic animation. The Tier 2 dragon opened up a path with a ferocious dragon breath, which offset most of the energy rays. As for the remaining rays, they struck the dragon scales that were filled with a metallic luster. Although they left a few bloody holes, it was not enough to threaten the dragon's life. The dragon swooped down at high speed. When the sharp hurricane passed through the dragon's sharp bones, spurs, and thorns, it let out a shrill howl. Relying on Ajua's flying skills, the dragon swooped down and accelerated, dragging the boulder behind it with its claws as it smashed down like a meteor. When its speed and momentum had been brewed to the peak, the giant dragon loosened its claw, curled its body into a ball, and rolled away from the side. As everyone watched, the boulder, which had reached its peak speed, whistled through the air and smashed into the outer wall of the metal fortress. Asterisk thud, asterisk after an earth-shattering boom. The outer wall caved in, forming a deep pit. The deafening sound of metal rang in the ears of Grimm and the others, and for a moment, they could not hear anything. At some point, Arms, the emerald dragons, and the green dragons had gathered behind Grimm, watching the scene on the screen curiously. Fire dragons. Arms lowered his huge body to Grimm's side and said gloatingly, "It's Felaba and her legion. You're out of luck." Felaba was the Tier 3 female flame dragon residing in Doomsday Castle. At the request of the Tier 2 wind dragon, Chax, she had sent her legion of Dragonborn to ambush Grimm and the others. Unfortunately, this legion of up to 300 Dragonborn and the 200 dragon followers accompanying them had been wiped out by the wizards in the depths of the Swamp of Sorrows. Since then, the female fire dragon had gone completely berserk. The first few times she had come to disturb the metal fortress, she had suffered greatly under the concentrated bombardment of the magic cannons. Not only did she not give up, she ran back to Doomsday Castle and desperately gathered more people. As a result, the male dragons who had once been her guests answered her summons and followed her to harass and attack the metal fortress. Thanks to them, the energy reserves of the metal fortress had not increased during this period of time. Instead, they had been drying up day by day, which was a source of frustration for the Tier 3 brain monster, Gazluvi. Even though the level 3 brain monster, Gazruvi's level was extremely high, its own offensive and defensive capabilities were extremely weak. Almost all of his power came from the magic furnace and the metal fortress. It could be said that the magic furnace was his heart, the metal fortress was his body, and Gazluvi was just a brain monster commanding them. Gazluvi had also tried to send the metal magic equipment out to chase the dragons away. Unfortunately, it was like sending sheep into a tiger's den. The number of people who could climb back in one piece could be counted on 2 hands. The rest were all smashed to smithereens by the Tyrannosauruses. Since then, Gazluvi no longer dared to send people out to challenge the dragons. Relying on the sturdy metal fortress and inexhaustible magic energy, he used the magic cannons to forcefully defend his position. However, because of this, the development plan of the lance plane that Grimm had handed to him before he left was ruined. The dragons had also learned their lesson. Since they had thick skin and flesh, they acted as the main force to entangle the metal fortress. On the other hand, the Draconid subordinates and vassal forces were deployed nearby, forming a tight killing line that sealed the metal fortress tightly within. To be honest, the Tier 3 brain monster, Gazluvi, had always been arrogant and condescending. Even though he had become Grimm's contracted slave, he only thought that he had made a mistake due to a moment of carelessness. In the depths of his heart, Gazluvi refused to admit that this Tier 2 wizard was smarter and more resourceful than he was. However, after these days of torture, Gazluvi had no choice but to painfully admit that he had no way to deal with a group of rogue dragons that did not play by the rules. He could only rely on the giant warships and cannons to keep them out of the fortress. As for the sealing line and strangulation line outside, he was basically helpless. He could only hide inside the metal fortress and muddle along. Therefore, when he suddenly saw Grimm return with such a large group of dragons, Gazluvi's heart that had been tormented for a long time was once again burning with passion. For the first time, he sincerely hoped that this week Wizard Master could come up with a way to expel these damned dragons from his territory as soon as possible. Facing Gazluvi's fervent request, Grimm did not respond. Instead, he turned around and looked at Arms beside him. "Lord Arms, what do you think of the current situation?" "GGG. Little fellow, are you begging me this time?" The Thunder Dragon's eyes suddenly lit up, and it immediately became unscrupulous. "You've extorted a lot of money from me this time. Now you want me to fight for you for free? I won't do it for 200,000 magic crystals, less than that." It had to be said that after hanging around Magi for so long, even a proud dragon would become unscrupulous and calculative. Grimm smiled faintly, his youthful and delicate face filled with unconcealable ridicule. "Lord Arms, you've brought back so many dragon companions this time. Where do you plan to put them? You can't possibly stuff them all into your territory, right?" Arms was stunned, and the smile on his face disappeared. For the first time, he began to consider this headache. Even as a Tier 3 Dragon Lord, the Thunder Dragon Arms territory only spanned 400 kilometers. In the human world, such a territory would be more than enough to house 20 to 30 human lords. However, to the dragons, such a territory was still too small. This time, he had suddenly brought back 11 dragons and was leading them through the streets. It was indeed very eye-catching, enough to make all the dragon lords envious. However, if he wanted to settle them down, his small territory would be stretched thin, and it would seem a little shabby. Chapter 720. The Lance Plane was a paradise for dragons. However, the prerequisite was that you had to be an orthodox dragon. Emerald dragons could not compare to pure gold dragons, but they were still considered true dragons. However, it was a pity that the green dragon that came along this time was not one of the orthodox dragon clan. If this inferior dragon's claws were a little harder and its strength was a little stronger, it was possible for it to make a name for itself. However, they would still be rejected by the true dragons who claimed to have pure bloodlines. If the emerald dragons that followed Armas to Lance became dragon lords, there would be no problem. However, if those green dragons became dragon lords, they would definitely be attacked by the other dragons nearby. This was an unwritten rule in the Lance Plane. Even Armas could not do anything about it. Back in the Farron Plain, Armas had made a lot of promises in one go to recruit the dragons. He had also painted a picture of a perfect paradise for dragons. If it couldn't be realized now, it would inevitably cause them to be disloyal and abandon it. Armas, the Grade 3 Thunder Dragon, could not help but fall silent after hearing Grimm's question. "Sir, now that you've recruited a strong army, why don't you take the opportunity to expand your territory?" Grimm sneered maliciously, clearly trying to fan the flames. Armas knew that Armas was just trying to fish in troubled waters, but the wizard's suggestion hit him in his weak spot. He could not help but hesitate. I only realized it after I came here. You dragons often fight amongst yourselves over territory. The winner gets the land, and the loser is forced to leave. Isn't that the truth? Grim continued to persuade Armas. But our dragon clan will never kill each other. Even the losers will be able to leave smoothly with their wealth. We will not allow outsiders to trample on our bottom line, Armas said arrogantly. Obviously, it did not have a good impression of wizards who killed people to the point of death and were ruthless towards their own people. Of course. I will not force you to go against the dragon spirit. Grim chuckled. However, Lord Arms, the next time you want to banish a dragon, can you give us a heads up first? You want the land and the people, and I want the loser. As long as the loser leaves its territory, it has nothing to do with you, right? Arms was speechless. He was once again shocked by the shrewdness and calculation of the human wizard. These human sorcerers seemed to have no principles or bottom line. Even among their own kind, they could not avoid tearing flesh off their bones. They were even more vicious to outsiders. However, no matter how he thought about it, this seemed to be the only way to solve this problem. After all, this time, he had been able to smuggle 11 dragons from the Fairn Plain to the Lance Plain. He had helped out greatly. According to the contract between Arms and Alice, the Tier 3 dragon would have to work for a long time before she could repay such a large sum of money. Arms gritted his teeth and made up his mind. I'll chase away these dragons for you. I won't charge you anything. However, from today onwards, I'll deal with the dragon lords in the territories that I've taken a liking to. You'll be in charge of taking care of the draconid armies and subordinate forces. If there are unexpected gains, I want half. Grim smiled leisurely. Arm's words were vague, but Grim understood what he was trying to say. Obviously, Arms wanted a share of the profits, but he didn't want to be stained with the blood of his own kind. From now on, Arms would be able to challenge his own kind in the name of a dragon lord. If the dragon lord lost, Arms would have no choice but to let the dragon lord leave with his wealth. At that time, the human sorcerers would be responsible for ambushing the dragon lord. The unexpected gains he was talking about were probably the dragon lord's personal treasures. Although this was not Grim's original intention, Grim still agreed and signed a new alliance contract with Arms. After the contract was signed, Arms commanded the 12 dragons to rush out of the metal fortress and pounce on the female dragon and the 6 male dragons that were still hovering in the sky. To be honest, even the rank 3 Felaba was shocked when she saw a large group of dragons rushing out of the metal fortress, not to mention the rank 1 and 2 male dragons. However, without any explanation, the group of giant dragons that suddenly appeared pounced on them, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws, and launched an attack on their own kind. They were outnumbered, and the dragons under Arms' command were of a higher rank than the female dragons' team. The two sides only clashed for a few rounds in the sky before one of the dragons in the team turned around and ran away. Dragon incantation shook the sky. Unfortunately, no matter how the female dragon cursed and roared, Arms did not say a word. Instead, he brought his beloved emerald dragon, Aratina, and attacked the female dragon. 2 rank 3 dragons worked together to deal with a single rank 3 female dragon. Even Felaba, who called herself the Star of Doom, could not withstand the ferocious attacks. Dragon blood rained down from the sky, and dragon scales the size of wash basins fell from the sky. Unable to withstand the pincer attack of the 2 dragons, the female dragon finally decided to retreat. Flapping her tattered red wings, she desperately flew back to her territory. As for the male dragons that were still fighting on the battlefield, she could not care less about them. Although they had the upper hand, Arms and the other dragons did not kill all of them. To be more precise, the Dragon Alliance did not allow dragons to kill each other. It was fine to fight for a mate or territory, but killing their own kind was not allowed. If a dragon killed its own kind, it would be punished by the great dragon god and become the common enemy of all dragons. Therefore, Even though Arms and the other dragons were much stronger in terms of rank and number, he could only watch as the dragons ran away. Gazlu, send out your eyeball guards and investigate the whereabouts and territories of all the dragons. How dare they come to our territory to show off? I'll find a chance to get rid of them one by one. Grim snorted coldly as he watched the two groups of dragons leave one after the other. As you wish. The dragon plague that had troubled him for half a year was finally over. Gazlu was filled with anger and fury. With Grim's permission, a rock in a hidden corner of the mountain where the metal fortress was located was gently moved to one side, revealing a huge entrance. 30 to 40 metal eyeballs swarmed out like a swarm of bees, chasing after the dragons as they flew into the distance. At the same time, more maintenance androids poured out of the metal fortress and began to repair the outer walls and magic cannons. There were even androids that gathered large chunks of rock from nearby and stuck them on the outer walls. That way, even dragons with their super eyesight would not be able to quickly identify the location of the metal fortress if they flew past from afar. Under Gazlu's control, the metal fortress was still continuously mining the metal veins beneath the mountain. The energy it needed came entirely from the magic furnace, and it did not rely on external sources. This way, it would not attract any attention. After smoothing out the development plans of a Lance dimension with a few words, Grim once again returned to the Blazing Flame Monarch through the teleportation formation. Wizard World, Blazing Flame Monarch. He had just come out of the teleportation formation when he met Gargamel, who had hurried over to welcome him. Have you dealt with the captives and spoils of war? Yes, Gargamel replied respectfully. All of the spoils of war have been stored in the Wizard's Pagoda's warehouse. As for the captives, they've been locked up on the second floor of the Wizard's Pagoda. Also, since my lord has returned successfully, do you think we should prepare a grand welcoming banquet tonight? Hearing this, Grim paused and muttered to himself for a moment. Even though he was not interested in such banquets, as the members of his family gradually grew stronger and expanded, such banquets would become a necessity. After all, this was an important way for the members of the family to get to know each other. Yes, I think that's fine. Just do as you see fit. The time is tonight, and the location is set to be on the third floor of the Wizard's Pagoda. Understood, my lord. I'll go and make the preparations right away. Nodding repeatedly, Gargamel gave a simple report of the Wizard's Pagoda situation before leaving quickly. Walking slowly to the residence on the fourth floor of the Wizard's Pagoda, Grim was not surprised to see Mary reclining on a large bed in the room. At some point in time, she had changed into a thin and soft black silk robe. The silk robe was not large, and it barely covered Mary's delicate shoulders. It revealed her smooth and beautiful snow-white neck, complete collarbone, and a small portion of her flesh. As for the bottom, it did not even reach her knees, revealing Mary's slender calves and beautiful, round ankles. Why, that Alice didn't let you stay there for the night? Mary's delicate and charming face was filled with a faint smile and unconcealable jealousy. Have you settled the matters on Lance's side? Even Grim could not help but swallow a mouthful of saliva as Mary's perfect, jade-like body gently stretched on the silky bed. Then do you have any plans for the celebration? Mary continued to ask in a seductive tone. She rolled around on the bed like a young lady. As her movements increased, the corners of the silk robe opened and closed, revealing her smooth, white thighs. Even the alluring triangular area became faintly discernible, causing Grim to lose his breath. I had wanted to take a bath and change before the banquet, but I've changed my mind. Oh, what did you change your mind about? Mary curiously stopped rolling around and asked as she propped herself up. Looking at the boundless beauty that was enough to make him restless, Grim roared in annoyance. I've decided. Before the banquet, I'll eat you up. Chapter 721. The welcome banquet was held on the third level of the Wizard's Pagoda. Those who could attend this banquet were the first batch of founding members of the Crimson family. Even though the family head Grim and Lady Mary had not arrived yet, the atmosphere was still as lively as ever. Most of the family sorcerers had just returned from other dimensions. They were all brimming with money, and even their individual abilities had increased by quite a bit. Putting everything else aside, just the insect Lich Bliss, who had never revealed himself, had already risen from intermediate tier 1 to peak tier 1. If everything went smoothly, in another 10 years or so, it could become the second family magus to successfully advance to rank 2 after Lady Mary. Level 2. To put it bluntly, this was the limit of most sorcerers' dreams. As for level 3 and 4, without exceptional talent or amazing encounters, most sorcerers would never be able to reach such a high level even if they worked hard for their entire lives. The Sorcerer's Handbook had a very comprehensive summary of the sorcerer's advancement system. First, to become a sorcerer, one had to have the talent to become a sorcerer, and then become an apprentice. The so-called talent to become a sorcerer referred to elemental talent. According to the Sorcerer Association statistics, in the sorcerer world, there was only a 31% chance of a mortal being born with elemental talent. This also meant that out of 1,000 mortals, there would at most be 13 apprentices with elemental talent. And of these 13 apprentices, half would become mortals again because they would not be able to master meditation. As for the rest, they would have to slowly advance step by step from beginner apprentice to mid-level apprentice, high-level apprentice, and prospective sorcerer before they would have the right to become a sorcerer. According to the statistics, the success rate of an apprentice advancing to become a sorcerer was less than 15%. However, this success rate could still be increased through various methods and resources. Thus, some sorcerers joked that the birth of a sorcerer's apprentice depended on luck, while the birth of a sorcerer depended on accumulation. No matter how bad a sorcerer's talent was, as long as the family was willing to devote resources to nurture them, the success rate of advancing to become a sorcerer would still far exceed those who had no one to rely on. However, the sorcerer world was fair. Those younger generation sorcerers who were immersed in a honeypot would not be able to increase their success rate to 100% no matter how many resources they spent. It would be difficult for them to even reach 80%. Therefore, having a mountain behind him could indeed increase the success rate by a lot, but there was still more than a 20% chance of failure. As for those sorcerer apprentices who had nothing, as long as they reached the standard of a quasi-sorcerer, they would have a 15% chance of succeeding in one go. Thus, no one dared to underestimate any quasi-shaman. Who knew if that dazzling protagonist halo would land on some unlucky fellow, allowing him to become the true master of the sorcerer world in one fell swoop? A sorcerer. Becoming a Tier 2 sorcerer was not something that could be achieved through experience and hard work. Most of the time, it required some special methods or some kind of strange talent. Otherwise, 70% of the sorcerers would not be rank 1 sorcerers, but rank 2 sorcerers. Compared to an orthodox magus like Meryl, the insect Lich Blitz's advancement speed was terrifying. From the time he had reached Tier 1 to the peak of Tier 1, it had only taken him a total of 70 years. The most direct reason for this situation was that he had been immersed in endless killing for almost his entire life. Regardless of whether it was the Goblin Plane, the Lance Plane, or the newly established Faerun Plane, he had participated in all of them and played an extremely important role. It was precisely this kind of bloody training that allowed Blitz to advance at a speed that far exceeded that of an ordinary person. Although Meryl, Dacella, Gargamel, and the rest were envious, they could only shake their heads and sigh. After all, they could not imitate such a bloody life. If they forced themselves to do so, they might lose their lives in some other plane before they could increase their strength. In the banquet hall on the 3rd floor of the Wizard's Pagoda, there were only a dozen sorcerers dressed in various robes. Meryl, who had rushed back from the Goblin Plane, pulled Dacella aside and asked in a low voice about their encounters in the Faerun Plane. From time to time, Meryl's gaze would sweep across the entrance of the banquet hall, obviously waiting for her teacher Grimm to arrive. As the host of the banquet, Gargamel frequently greeted the sorcerers in the hall. Beside him stood the gorgeous and graceful forest demon, who used a cold and indifferent expression to force back every female acolyte who tried to approach Gargamel. Between the two of them, a beautiful girl in a jade-green dress held the forest demon's hand tightly, her eyes filled with curiosity as she scanned the hall. She, too, had the strength of a level 1 sorcerer. Other than these few human sorcerers, the rest were probably all sorcerers of different races. Medusa and the leader of the Chimeras, Karen, were closer. The two of them occupied a corner of the hall, quietly sipping wine like the human sorcerers and whispering to each other. The only group that could maintain the atmosphere of the banquet was the group of vampires that Mary had brought back. Soros and Winsoul were the only two remaining Blood Knights. They wore dazzling blood-red armor and had a pair of curled-up blood-red bat wings on their backs. Their entire appearance was majestic and imposing. In stark contrast to them were 6 blood elves who were at Tier 1 and Tier 2. There were men and women among them, but even the male blood elves had delicate and handsome faces. It was difficult to determine their gender just by looking at their faces. These blood elves were obviously unwilling to be left out. They took the lead and danced in the hall. With their charming faces and graceful dance moves, they successfully attracted the attention of all the sorcerers present. The atmosphere of the banquet instantly became lively. Other than the orthodox sorcerers, there were 7 or 8 prospective sorcerers who could attend the banquet. Although they could not enjoy the treatment of sorcerers, they were not the main characters of this banquet. However, as a reserve force trained by their families, they could still attend a family banquet like this and experience the atmosphere and ways of interacting with sorcerers in advance. Of course, if they could use this banquet to gain the favor of a sorcerer, they would definitely have a source of resources in the future. Therefore, these male and female prospective sorcerers were all meticulously prepared and dressed up. The men were handsome and strong, while the women were delicate and lovely. They surrounded the field and chatted amiably, forming a beautiful scene in the banquet. As for the goblin merchant, Cabby, he was an active member of the banquet. Relying on its experience as Grimm's follower, it leisurely wandered among different small circles and groups. He used the passion of a goblin merchant to converse with everyone, talking cheerfully and wittily, as if he was the main character of the banquet. The ones in charge of serving the entire banquet were a group of specially selected female acolytes, as well as a few especially docile servants from another world, the forest elves. It had to be said that there would always be some who were especially stubborn and conservative in any group, but there would also be some who knew how to adapt. This batch of forest elves had only been transported to the Blazing Flame Monarch for less than half a day, and some of them had already accepted their new identities. They wore slave collars and seriously took on the role of elven maids. This was actually their wisdom. Almost all of the forest elves that Grimm had transported back from Faerun were fighters, and there was no lack of grade 2 powerhouses among them. In another plane, they might be the nobles of the nobles, but here, they were nothing more than delicate dolls in the hands of the sorcerers. If they were more docile, they might be able to live longer. If they continued to be stubborn, they would end up on the dissection table or in the laboratory. Of course, it was common for evil magi with special fetishes to turn them into sex slaves or keep them as specimens. Finally, halfway through the banquet, Grimm, who was dressed in black Magus robes, and Magus Mary, who was dressed up nicely, entered the banquet hall together. Behind the two of them were Dragonman Zachary and the Goblin Tigul. The arrival of the 4 grade 2 magi from the family immediately pushed the atmosphere of the banquet to a climax. All the magi from the family stopped chatting and dancing, standing and applauding in unison. On the other hand, the young quasi-sorcerers surrounding the scene clapped their hands loudly. Their faces were flushed, and they were excited to see this legendary figure in their families again. It was said that this Crimson Tribe leader was a powerful figure who had climbed to grade 2 with his own strength. He had risen to power in the Swamp Tower and made a name for himself in the Dark Caves. He was especially adept at controlling elemental puppets. He had once defeated a quasi-magus as a high-ranked acolyte, and, as a quasi-magus, he had turned the entire volcano world upside down. However, what showed this legendary figure the most was a secret battle that no one knew about. Three young magi who had just leveled up, with their lives in their hands, had actually turned the situation around and killed the evil Magus who had wanted to sacrifice the three of them. This had also become his most famous battle. From then on, he could not be stopped. From a lonely and nameless ordinary Magus, he quickly grew to become an extremely powerful elite Magus. Fire Demon. Fire Demon. Similar titles appeared on him again and again, each time indicating the fall of a powerful enemy. Along the way, he had successfully established his own Magus Tower in the Dark Forest. As for his subsequent adventures in other planes, his summoning of powerful dragon beasts to slaughter the vampire family, and his successful return from the other plane, each of these events firmly marked the rise of a powerful figure. To be honest, why were the Magi, Quasi-Magi, and Acolytes present here? It was to be able to rely on this powerful Magus and enjoy some of the benefits of war that normal people could not hope to obtain. If the Crimson family rose to power under the leadership of this legendary leader, then those who joined earlier would be able to obtain more resources and benefits. Chapter 722. The appearance of Grimm and Mary immediately set off the first wave of excitement in the family banquet. Grimm was not a physique refinement sorcerer, so he did not have monstrous muscles that were as hard as iron. However, with a height of 2 meters and a well-proportioned body, he had an almost perfect body, strong and firm muscles, dark red and glossy skin, and a strange tattoo that covered his neck. Grimm stood proudly, his dark red hair hanging loosely behind him, almost reaching his waist. Coupled with the red glow in his black eyes, he exuded a demonic, mysterious, and wise sorcerer aura. Mary, who was holding hands with him, was also very charming at this moment. She was a mature and beautiful peerless beauty. Mary's face was exquisite and perfect, with a strong, three-dimensional sense. A lazy and satisfied smile hung on her small red lips. A pair of sparkling red eyes were like two pure and flawless rubies embedded in her exquisite face, making her look exceptionally charming and enchanting. Mary did not have the habit of wearing armor, so most of her white and tender skin was exposed. Her sexy and hot body was simply wrapped in a thin red chiffon dress. The chiffon dress was not big, and the upper part could only cover a small part of her snow-white flesh. The lower part was shrunk to above her knees, revealing most of her smooth, round, and jade-like legs. Rather than saying that this kind of clothing was covering, it was more of a different kind of temptation. It was difficult to associate such a beautiful girl with a powerful and evil sorcerer just by looking at her appearance. However, the small and exquisite dark red bat wings on Mary's back, as well as her blood-red eyes, constantly reminded others of her identity. This was like a taboo and dangerous, thrilling game. Step by step, she tempted others to forget themselves and throw themselves into her beautiful burning flame. For some reason, seeing such a handsome, robust, and refined legendary sorcerer walking hand in hand with Mary, all the women present could not help but feel a sense of loss and disappointment while staring at them in a daze. If only they were the ones holding hands with Grimm. How wonderful would that be? Mary's blood-red eyes slowly swept across the audience, and a faint smile once again appeared on her lips. However, as her eyes swept across, the people who were absent-minded broke free from their stupor and hurriedly applauded and offered their blessings with smiles. Just now, when their spiritual power came into contact with Mary's bloody and intense spiritual power, they suddenly retreated like snow rabbits that had encountered a ferocious wolf. It was only at this moment that they realized that the person they were jealous of was a genuine rank 2 Magus. If he angered the other party and punished him harshly, no one present would be able to protect or save him. "You're quite charming." Mary walked gracefully as she communicated with Grimm telepathically, I sensed a trace of murderous intent from the eyes of those girls. Grimm had a faint smile on his face as he nodded to the people present. He secretly transmitted his voice to them. I'm a very conservative person. If you continue to wear such revealing clothes, I'll spank you, but when we get back, let's fight then. It's not like you haven't fought before. Although he said that, a red mist surged around Mary's body. In the blink of an eye, that sexy and revealing red dress was replaced by an exquisite red evening gown. Even Grimm, who was very close to her, did not manage to catch her movements and methods. I'll say this first, I'll listen to you this time. When we get back, you have to play Queen's game with me. Mary rolled her eyes and immediately came up with a new idea. Grimm laughed heartily, his tall and sturdy body emitting a domineering aura. All right, as long as you can beat me, I'll listen to you. Mary immediately went berserk. Grimm calmly let go of Mary's dangerous little hand and strode to the center of the hall, clapping his hands twice. Seeing that the family head had something to say, the noise in the hall immediately died down. Everyone held their breaths and focused their attention on this legendary figure. All Magi of the Crimson family, as the family head, I need to drink 3 cups with everyone today. We've experienced so many planar wars, and some of the familiar figures by our side have left forever. This first cup is a toast to those who have sacrificed their lives for the family. To Sabrina, to Ender. With that, Grimm downed the wine in his cup in one gulp. To Sabrina, to Ender, the Magi all responded loudly and downed the wine in one gulp with solemn expressions. The maids hurriedly walked around the hall and refilled the cups of the Magi. This second cup of wine is a toast to all of you. It is because of your hard work and careful planning that the Crimson family has the possibility of steadily advancing. To everyone. With that, Grimm downed the wine in one gulp. All the sorcerers had excited smiles on their faces as they drank to their heart's content. This third cup of wine is for a beautiful future. I believe that with everyone's hard work, the Crimson family, as well as every single one of us, will achieve our dreams and walk towards glory. The Magi all responded in unison and raised their cups to drink. Among them, the gnome cabbie's shrill voice was the most prominent. Taking advantage of the crowd's excitement and the rising atmosphere, Grimm loudly announced the internal rewards for the Magi of the family. This time, the Fair and Plain had returned with a bountiful harvest. Though the losses were great, the gains were not small either. This was the perfect opportunity for the Magi of the family to share in the profits of the war. The Magi who had participated in the planar war had gained 4 to 5 times more than the Magi who had stayed behind. There were also opportunities to collect personal spoils and resources on the battlefield. Hence, once the list of battle results was announced, it was clear who was the core of the family and who was the fringe. It had to be said that the ones who had gained the most in the Fair and Plain were Mary and Bliss. Both of them had led their troops to attack a path, creating the best battlefield environment for the main force of the family to attack the Central Mountain Range. As a rank 2 vampire sorceress with so many powerful servants, no one would find it strange that she was at the top of the list of battle results. However, as a rank 1 magus, Bug Lich Bliss had actually suppressed 2 other rank 2 Magi and was ranked second only to Mary. This was undoubtedly out of everyone's expectations. Grimm announced that Bliss would also become a core magus of the Crimson family and would enjoy the basic benefits of a rank 2 magus in advance. This also showed that Grimm was optimistic about Bug Lich Bliss development and was prepared to nurture him to become the family's 6th rank 2 magus. After hearing all this, all the Magi and prospective Magi of the family could not help but look at Bliss with envy. They knew that from now on, this Bug Lich Bliss would also become a rising star of the Crimson family. The only thing they could do was to raise their cups to greet him. Even at the family gathering, Bug Lich Bliss wore a thick robe, not revealing a single bit of skin on his body. As he had evolved too thoroughly, there was no longer any trace of a human on his body. He looked completely like a bug man. Therefore, in order to avoid being too shocking, he could only cover himself with a thick robe wherever he went to avoid those surprised or fearful gazes. In the face of such an honor, Blitz did not feel smug at all. Instead, he used his deerskin gloves' insect pincer to raise his wine glass in return. The two big and two small eyes of the two ferocious insect heads hidden in the shadow of the hood emitted a breathtaking green fluorescence. As a participant in the conquest of the Faron Plain, Bliss knew very well that the family's purpose in entering this plane was not for the so-called resources or plunder, but for the witches of destiny in the Arctic North. After this battle, the amount of resources and captives they obtained were secondary. The main goal was to help Alice advance to rank 2 and allow the Witches of Destiny to show signs of merging with the Crimson family. Thus, the Crimson family's biggest gain this time was actually gaining the trust of the Witches of Destiny led by Alice. Thus, in a situation where it was difficult for outsiders to know, the Tower of Fate in the north had already become the Crimson family's outpost to explore the Northern Witches' territory. As a powerful rank 2 fire wizard, Grimm had the full support of the Blood Queen Mary on his left and the leader of the Witches of Destiny, Alice, on his right. Once he was given a chance to develop, he was destined to soar into the sky with an unstoppable force. It was because he deeply understood this that Buglich Bliss put away all the ambitions and expectations he should and should not have. He began to seriously consider his relationship with Grimm. His bug body was bestowed to him by Grimm, and the bug queen that had completely fused with his soul was also bestowed by Grimm. Thus, if Bliss had any other thoughts, it would be hard to guarantee that he would not be forcefully suppressed by Grimm. Perhaps staying in the Crimson family was not a bad choice. Just as the Crimson family was celebrating, the Tower of Destiny in the north was feeling both pain and joy. The leader of the witches, Alice, had successfully returned and successfully advanced to rank 2. This was undoubtedly something to celebrate and be happy about. However, 4 of the 7 Witches of Destiny who had followed her were forever slumbering in that distant foreign world. This was undoubtedly a heavy blow to the Witches of Destiny who had just started out. Thus, under the leadership of Ice, Witch Chave, and Violent, Witch Sophia, the captives and spoils of war that they had captured from the foreign world were simply distributed. Alice then went to the cold astrological platform on the top floor alone. Here, in this cold and silent world, Alice hugged her knees and curled up in a corner of the hall. She looked up at the dazzling starry sky and silently shed 2 streams of tears. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.